Welcome to the Duke University Living History Program, founded by Mr. J. Rutherford and chaired now by Professor Richard Watson of our History Department. My name is James David Barber. I'm in the Political Science Department, and we are going to be interviewing today myself and two professors, Mr. John Topasky from the History Department and Mr. Taylor Cole from the Political Science Department. And it is our honor today to be interviewing, as we approach his 75th birthday, Angier Biddle Duke, who has done a great deal of diplomacy of the history of the United States and will be interviewed today from one end of that to the other. Welcome, Mr. Duke, to this program. And we would like to begin, I think, given the fact that you have done diplomacy and leadership in diplomacy in so many different ways. What kind of conclusion do you come to as to the qualifications that are most essential for the conduct of diplomacy? What do you see as the main criteria for excellence in diplomacy leadership? Could you start with that, please?
I think, to address myself squarely to your question, I think that the backbone and the structure of our diplomatic efforts around the world lie with the Foreign Service and all that the qualifications of the Foreign Service require. It is the excellence, the preparation, the examination system. When one gets into the Foreign Service and starts a Foreign Service career, one knows that the individual has the excellence that's required to make it. So I think that again, the structure, the foundation, what we have to rely on in the conduct of foreign affairs primarily is the tools that we have to work with are the Foreign Service officers. And whether you are a brilliant political appointee, such as Ed Reischauer was in Japan, or Mike Mansfield, or Ken Galbraith in India, or David Bruce in London, or today, General Vernon Walters in Germany, those brilliant exponents of the non-career system have to rely on the brilliance, the excellence, and the good preparation that the Foreign Service offers.
It's really a team operation, isn't it, to produce this diplomatic success?
It's team, it's specialized knowledge. For instance, I'll give you one example. When I went out to Vietnam in the 1970s, I was enormously impressed by the Vietnamese language capacity of our embassy. Now, the French had been there for over 100 years. The United States had been there for a decade or two, and yet we had more Vietnamese-speaking officers in our embassy than the French had. And it means that when we've set our minds to something, we can accomplish what we want to, given the human material that we can draw upon. And that's what the Foreign Service can produce.
Would you be so kind as to turn to the early part of your life and tell us what helped you in those early days, in your later days when you were into diplomatic leadership?
Well, I was a late starter in life, David. My father was killed when I was 7 years old, and my mother remarried a wonderful, brilliant, intellectual and cultural figure. He was an architect. My stepfather was Tom Robertson, who was a fine man, but distanced himself from bringing up mother's children. He was a remote figure from my life and not necessarily a role model. And my mother, warm, human, exciting, thrilling personality, didn't really give me much direction. And I found in my teenage years that my mother's younger brother, Tony Biddle, was a very thrilling personality who had been appointed by Franklin Roosevelt as his minister to Norway. Oh. And we would spend a month or so at then they were called legations, at the legation in Oslo. And my uncle took a summer place in Austria between the time he was minister to Norway and ambassador to Poland. And one of the things that is indelibly imprinted on my mind was a hunting party that he gave in Austria for the King of Spain. Alfonso XIII came and stayed with him with his two sons, Don Juan, who's the present Count of Barcelona, the father of the present King of Spain, and his younger brother, a man called Don Gonzalo, who was about my age. I was then about 16 or 17. Mm-hmm. And the conversations at night between King Alfonso and my uncle on the European situation, the analysis of Hitler, the analysis of Schuschnigg in Austria, what was happening in Central Europe, were so dazzling and so thrilling and so exciting that it was a mesmerizing adventure of the mind as far as I was concerned. So when I finally got into Yale, I signed up for what they called pre-diplomatic track, and I studied Spanish and history and did the conventional preparation for a diplomatic career, but I got off that track. I got married, the war came along. Mm-hmm. I should have gone back to college after the war. I didn't, and drifted for a year or two after the war, and I finally had an opportunity in 1948 to meet an extraordinary man who was between assignments. Mm-hmm. It was Stanton Griffiths. He'd been sent by Truman first to Poland, then to Egypt, and was between assignments, and he and I became very close. He was a great backer of Harry Truman, and he persuaded me to become politically active and to interest myself in the Truman campaign. And when Harry Truman won the election, Stanton Griffiths told me he was going to get a diplomatic assignment and asked me if I were interested. Now, I've got to be somewhat light when I tell you how I engaged his interest. I was conducting an auction of golfers at a golf tournament, and here was this former ambassador in the audience, and afterwards, when we went off for a swim, he said to me, "I never saw you on your feet before. I didn't know that you could handle a crowd. I didn't know that you could speak so well on your feet. Do you speak Spanish?" I said yes. I'd studied it at school, and that I felt I was pretty competent in it. He said, "How would you feel about an assignment in the Foreign Service?" Well, the point of the story is he was appointed by Harry Truman to be ambassador to Argentina, and after many more conferences and conversations, he arranged for me to go down to the Foreign Service Institute, and I had an oral exam, and I got what was known as a lateral entry into the Foreign Service. I was appointed a Class 4 officer, Foreign Service Reserve, a 4-year appointment, renewable, and in 1949, I was assigned as second secretary and consul at the embassy in Buenos Aires, and that was my start.
That's fascinating. Some of that can be traced back to that evening at which you were excited about diplomacy and the like.
It congealed it in my mind.
It must have been a terrible tragedy to lose your father so early. And then would it be accurate to say that you did diplomacy with Tom Watson? That is, you had a certain separateness, but nevertheless you got along with him and he was with you.
With Tom Robertson?
Tom Robertson.
Tom and I were very respectful of one another. Yeah. But he was an architect and an artist, And that wasn't my field or my interest,
Yeah.
although I respected him tremendously. And in some ways we were close. But on the other hand, he was not a parent to me.
Right.
It was different. He was my stepfather, a man who I respected greatly, but we didn't really interconnect in a father-son relationship.
I see. And did you do team sports?
Yes, I did team sports at St. Paul's School. I was sent to St. Paul's when I was 12 years old. And it was a church school, Episcopal church school in New England, a rigorous, tough school, and we were required to do team sports. Now, I wasn't a great athlete. I was a middling one. So I always made the second or third team in football. I was always the second or third on the hockey team. I rode on the crew. I happened to be captain of, I think it was the third crew. There were 6 crews. And then in my sixth form final year, my senior year, I was made manager of the hockey team. I was put in various administrative positions. I was never considered myself a great athlete, but I always did everything.
But you were a team player with them.
I was a team player.
Don't
right.
you think that carried over some to
I
your...
hope to. I like to think so.
Yeah.
I hope so.
Yeah. Could you tell us about your education at Yale University, how that might have concentrated in various ways or might have trained you in
well,
things that
again, they did have a thing called pre-diplomatic, a pre-diplomatic track at Yale, and I took those required courses which were considered necessary, in other words, 2 foreign languages, French and Spanish, modern history, political science, English, of course. They were not specialized, and I believe that's no longer, it's dropped as a title, as a discipline at universities now. But it kept me, it kept my mind on it. I was very interested, although I didn't see how I was going to break through to it. When I went around the world in 1938, I saw Joe Grew in Tokyo and got to talking to him quite personally and intimately. And he was our ambassador there. His son-in-law was Cecil Lyon, who was the secretary of the embassy in Peking. And the two of them encouraged me a great deal to apply to go into the Foreign Service. They felt that I could do it. And I was considering it when the war came along. Then I was 5 years in the Army. And when I came out, I drifted around for a couple of years until I ran into Stanton Griffiths and got the opportunity to move in on this lateral entry.
Do you recall from those college days any particular things that you studied that were especially intriguing to you? Any book you read or who your heroes were in those days?
I was thinking the area at that time that I was most interested in were the Balkans. Oh. I was interested in Serbia, Yugoslavia, the smaller countries, how they defined their individual personalities as nations, the ethnic rivalries and divisions. That became sublimated later on into more interest in Latin America. But that's what got me involved in much of the political science and the political history of that particular time. I can't recall more specifics for you right now.
But that must really give you insight now as to what's happening in Eastern Europe and that whole situation.
Very much
because
so.
You started out with that.
It's curious because we think we're entering into a dangerous world. It is dangerous, but it's dangerous in the 19th century sense. We're facing the same problems today that Metternich and Talleyrand faced in their days. In other words, the ethnicities, the xenophobia, the nationalisms, they're rather familiar problems to us. It's a different problem than the nuclear, the threat of nuclear war, which was going to be the end of our civilization. We're going back now to the, I would say, the good old days when you had horrible old problems, which we were used to in the 19th century, which I much prefer, much prefer to the nuclear winter that we faced when we had the bipolar confrontation between the great powers.
Now later on we're going to ask you questions about presidents that you worked with in diplomacy, but in those days you were coming up under Franklin Roosevelt. You were,
yes.
You were emerging under Franklin Roosevelt, and as a youth, what was your attitude toward Franklin Roosevelt? What did you hear about that man?
I felt Franklin Roosevelt had all the answers.
Oh.
I really felt that he had saved our economic system, he had saved our political system. Any of us who had gone through the Depression and grown up in the Depression, when you had in your own class children, your classmates, parents who had thrown themselves from windows, and why isn't Johnny in class today? His father has committed suicide. The Depression affected everybody in this country, and the person who we thought had brought the ship into harbor was Franklin Roosevelt. I thought he had the answers. And when he was killed, when he died in 1944, I thought that the key to our relationship with the Soviet Union died with him. I think on reading it over and getting to know more about his illness at Yalta and Potsdam, at Yalta, I think I'm wrong about that. I think that Roosevelt was failing in his later years, and he didn't have the answer to the relationship with Stalin. But you're asking me what I thought.
Yeah.
I thought at the time that FDR had the key to working with the Soviet Union, and his relationship with Stalin would ensure a peaceful world after World War II. I think I'm wrong, but I didn't think so at the time.
The hope was there. And your family was mostly Democrats, weren't they?
Well, my uncle Tony Biddle was the Democrat in the family. My mother was really non-political. My stepfather was a Republican. And so I grew up in a Republican household, dazzled by the personality of my uncle.
I see. Your capacity for diplomacy is beginning to emerge here. That is, you had a Republican, a Democrat, and a non-person in one of these ways. And you mentioned the Depression period. Was your family struck by the Depression? Were you?
We were kids. We wouldn't know about it. I mean, the answer is materially probably not. We weren't. I mean, our family was not particularly opulent, but we were well off, and therefore protected from the really tough side of the Depression. But the atmosphere of fear all around us, the terror among friends and family.
In school.
And to have people actually commit suicide, the parents or the fathers in one's own class, brought home the reality of what was going on.
Then you were in the military service for 4 years?
5 years.
5 years.
Yeah.
Could you tell us about that? What did you do in that?
Well, I knew I was going to be drafted, so I didn't want to have the ignominy of being drafted. So I beat the draft by volunteering.
When was that?
That was in January 1941. I had also
well before Pearl Harbor.
Well before, yes. I had also gone to a civilian military training camp at Plattsburgh in 1940, because I didn't graduate from college and was very conscious of that. And so therefore I signed up for a CMTC, and I went off for a couple of weeks to Plattsburgh to prepare. And then in January I signed up, I volunteered, and in January, and went in and went to Fort Dix.
Fort Dix?
Fort Dix for you know, basic training.
Right.
And got transferred to Camp Lee, and I soon found I soon found, first of all, plunging into the great unknown of the Army was a traumatic experience for me at that particular moment of my life, not knowing what in the world to expect, scared to death. But I found that everybody else was scared. All the other kids that came in with me. And they, funnily enough, turned to me for help and guidance and a certain amount of leadership. And I found myself moving ahead quite fast. I became a corporal within a month or so. And by the next September, I was a sergeant and a candidate for officers training school. So in January 42, I guess it was, I graduated from OTC and was moved to the Air Transport Command Intelligence in Washington, D.C. I won't go through it all, but to tell you that every step of life is always important and always interesting. And that period in the War Department, working for Colonel Stimson, I saw so many people, including General Eisenhower, General Marshall. I was in charge of the war room for Colonel Stimson. When I say in charge, I was a second lieutenant at the maps with a pointer. And when the Secretary of War come in the morning, Colonel Stimson, I would have to read the cables, place the battle order on the map for the Secretary to have him understand the world military situation in the morning. And now there was other more ranking and senior officers, but I was the guy that did it, put the pins in and interpreted the cables and so forth. It was a fascinating experience. And then I was transferred overseas. I was sent to England. The most traumatic and interesting and the most desperate thing that happened to me in the war, that I was in on the liberation of Buchenwald. That was, to me, the most extraordinary experience that happened during that whole time.
May we hear about that? Can you
just
tell us
let me
what happened?
say something about it that I don't see written about it. As you approached Buchenwald, and if I remember rightly, I was riding in an open Jeep, you could smell the stench before you could see the camp. Before you came it, you felt this overwhelming human odor that became more and more intense and more disgusting as you came closer to it. The camp gates were open. There were 50,000 human beings inside, and they were so degraded that they didn't rush out. They clung to the security of the life they knew in that camp. They didn't leave. They were subhuman zombies inside, wandering around. Now, we've seen all the stacks of the cadavers on row and row and row of them. That is ghastly enough, but you get used to that. What I couldn't get used to were, again, the subhuman, craven, zombie human beings that were left. I can recall one who spoke a little English. He was a professor from the University of Warsaw. He came up and he kissed my hand and slobbered over me like a dog and asked for a cigarette. It was to see a man of his intellect reduced to a slobbering animal is the most vile experience I can possibly express to you. And there were thousands and thousands and thousands of them in the camp like that.
What does that mean to you? What is that left in your mind and heart about people?
It's hard to believe that human beings are capable of that. I must tell you that I didn't think that it was by design that this had happened. That I don't believe even the German camp commanders, and I saw them too. I saw the lampshades of human skin. I saw all the things that have been written about. But what I saw was what happens in wartime when you are given, where inferiors, subordinates, are given a job to do that they can't do. In other words, you're in charge of an area that could possibly accommodate in a civilized or a decent way 5,000 people, and the superiors send trainload after trainload after trainload in on you, and there are 50,000 people which at the most could hold 5. There isn't food for them. You can't control them, so that every brutal aspect of guards come out to control an uncontrollable situation, so that these human beings become bludgeoned to keep them under control. They're starved because there isn't enough food. There is no water to clean them. It's a situation that isn't done by fiendish design. It's the result of a policy that gets out of control.
It's very interesting and very terrible, is it not? And then you came home again.
Yeah.
Happier time, the end of the war.
Yes, right. A happier time, and also a directionless time. I couldn't figure out what to do with myself. I knew I was interested in international affairs. I was offered one job that interested me very much. I was offered the job of director of American Airlines, their Paris office. They were going to, American Export Lines had been bought by American Airlines, and they set up a Paris office. And I was called and asked, would I take that job? Now, I had run the Paris office for the Air Transport Command. I knew that area. I could have done that. And my wife at the time didn't want to move to Paris. I had just come home. It just didn't fit, and I turned that thing down. I've always kicked myself for it in some ways, and yet if I'd taken it, I might not have had the opportunity that happened a couple of years later. But I fooled around in business enterprises, particularly in the international export and import business, which was very popular in the post-war period, not terribly successfully, until Stanton Griffiths and I got together, and I worked this appointment, and my life then took off.
Into diplomacy.
Yeah, into the Foreign Service.
This is just the moment then to turn to Professor Taylor Cole, who knows a lot more about that than any of the rest of us, and who's actually been engaged in it himself, to ask him about what that means. Taylor, would you?
I wonder, Mr. Duke, if I might ask just one or two preliminary questions growing out of Mr. Barber's discussion. You spoke highly of the qualifications of members of the Foreign Service and the role that they played. The ambassadors that you mentioned were political appointees. Let's take David Bruce, for example. Do I understand from your answers that you would argue very strongly for the procedures that are used to bring individuals into the Foreign Service, but also argue for political appointments of ambassadors?
Yes, I hope I made myself clear. I think that the Foreign Service is the absolute foundation of the implementation of our foreign policy. But I think that all bureaucracies need an injection of outside talent. I think there's a good deal to be said about the synergy between good political appointees and the bedrock capabilities of the Foreign Service. When you do get good appointees like Kenneth Galbraith, ambassador to India, David Bruce in London, Vernon Walters now in Germany, who's been a career military officer all his life, ambassador in Germany. I remember a story about when Ken Galbraith was appointed to New Delhi, how the quality of the political reporting immediately improved. The commercial officers writing to the Commerce Department improved. competition sets in, and a synergistic reaction sets in, and everybody works better when it works. Now, when you have bad apples, when you have political payoffs, when you have mediocrities, then the system doesn't work right, and the role of the ambassador is denigrated and degraded.
Might I ask a second preliminary question? You entered the Foreign Service in Argentina and Denmark during the period when Joe McCarthy was at his height. What was your impression of his impact on you and on the Foreign Service?
When I was in Madrid as a junior officer in 1952 and was appointed from there ambassador to El Salvador, and I must tell you, I was 35, I think, at the time. I must tell you that that was an overwhelmingly important event in my life, to be appointed chief of mission. And I had tunnel vision of the Spanish-speaking and Hispanic world. Dulles was an East-West man. When he came in 1953, he was more concerned about East-West relations. He was a Europeanist. And Latin America did not come within his purview. He wasn't interested in it. The appointments that Eisenhower was making in 1953 were all European and East-West oriented, so they didn't affect my part of the world. But you couldn't live in isolation. Naturally, we were conscious of the fact that Chip Boland was put on hold for the best part of a year by Senator McCarthy. Yes, I was conscious of that. But McCarthy did not stretch his reach down into the area in which I was most intimately concerned and involved.
As ambassador, and you have had more experience, I think, as ambassador in various places than any individual with whom I'm acquainted. 4 3 continents, 4 embassies, as well as other ambassadorial appointments. Might I ask, as an ambassador, did you feel you were representing the people of the United States, the government of the United States, the President of the United States? What did you feel you were representing as an ambassador?
I'm very conscious of the fact that the appropriations that paid my salary and my staff came from the congressional appropriation to the Department of State. And although my commission was signed by the President Truman shook me by the hand and wished me well and gave me a letter to deliver to the President of Salvador when I left. I was, both my political loyalties, my personal loyalties, all to President Truman. But I regarded as my boss, Dean Acheson. So I want to let you know that I was very much a State Department man. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it answers. But as a State Department man, you certainly had instances in which there were conflicts brought to your attention from,
well, certainly I can give
say,
you...
Defense Department and State Department.
Right.
And
in Salvador, going back to that, I could go... Salvador, we had one of the great successes of the Truman presidency was the Point 4 program. Our Point 4 program in Salvador was beginning to take hold. It was directed towards the creation and building of a middle class. It, for instance, set up alternative credit structures to the Banco Nacional. They were setting up what is a bad word to use now, savings and loan institutions, which would give credit to campesinos, to farmers, to buy their own land, to set up small businesses, coffee processing plants, dry cleaning plants, small business loans. This was working. we were creating a middle class in Salvador. This was a success. Now, they had more money. The aid program had more money than the State Department budget for running my embassy. And so there was a certain amount of friction between the staff of my embassy and the Point 4 program administrators, the aid administrators. My job was to conciliate and to harmonize and give leadership to the American presence in Salvador, which I tried to do. But I was certainly there, the person who was the orchestra leader of some dissonant voices in competition with one another. Now that wasn't all that serious, but your point was much more serious was in Spain. Our political objectives in Spain are long range. They're to harmonize the national interests of the United States with the national interests of the Spanish people. And our military objectives are not necessarily along those lines. And therefore, we had I inherited when I arrived in 1965 a very powerful, very strong military presence there. One of the great, most serious errors was to place our most important base at Torrejon, at the capital of Spain. So we had an American military presence of some 12,000 men in the Spanish political capital. Obviously, this would be unacceptable. It would be like you had a great and friendly nation, let us say like our ally Germany, operating Dulles Airport in Washington. So no matter how friendly one is, we were the dominant military presence in the capital of the country. And from a State Department political point of view, to me, I'd like to phase them out. I think it would be better we would have a better military presence in Spain. It would have lasted longer if we could have moved our military people out of Torrejon, because if you would station them off in the provinces, it would be less of a political irritant. Well, my military colleagues were outraged, and they had a good deal going. This was close to the military headquarters of what was a military, in many ways, a military state. So I was at odds with the Defense Department. So that was one of the big challenges while I was ambassador in Spain.
How did you settle it, or how was it
It never
settled?
was settled, because to go back to the way you phrased your question, my loyalties and my way I worked, although very conscious of role as representing the American people and the President of the United States, I went through channels to the Secretary of State. I never had any direct contact with the Secretary of Defense, whom I knew personally. Bob McNamara was a personal friend of mine and my wife's. The only time I felt it necessary to contact him directly across this divide between state and defense was after the Palomares nuclear incident. There was a division of opinion as to how to handle the recovery of the atom bomb that had been lost. And the press and my staff all said, it must be verified, the fact that this bomb has been found. It must be seen to be believed.
Yeah.
And the Defense Department said, under no condition, no way. That's a classified information, and it cannot be viewed. I called Bob McNamara on the phone from Madrid, and I said, Bob, we're going to be, our credibility on this fantastic operation that the Navy has done, how to find this 8 or 10 foot object in the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. They did the most extraordinary job in finding it. They finally did. Took them 3 or 4 months to do it, but they did. Now, you're going to get it out, and the world won't believe it unless they see it. Please, Bob, let's work out a way to verify the fact that this bomb has been found. He said, you're absolutely right, sure. Well, what happened was that they put the bomb on a destroyer. They put the press, and there was 1,000 members of the press from all over the world on the aircraft carrier. I can't remember what it was called. I think it was the Franklin D. Roosevelt. And the press were on that deck of the aircraft carrier, and they brought the destroyer alongside so that the press could see it and could photograph it, and they knew that the bomb had been found. But it took that kind of an effort to get State and Defense. I had to make that call to get State and Defense to agree to do it.
If there had not been an agreement, you would have taken your orders from the State.
The Department of State.
Yes, that would have been fine. May I ask, you are certainly involved in many instances where real basic policy decisions were involved. Did you find any instances where you were so opposed to what you consider to be the American policy as emanating from Washington that you took very strong steps to oppose or to react against, perhaps even threatened to resign? Were there any instances in which?
Oh, Taylor, that's an awfully interesting question. I wish I could paint myself as a hero. No, I can't think of anything that would make me resign. I had some things I believed in very much. I'll tell you two stories. One, I believed that the United States could be helpful in the solution or an approach to a solution on Gibraltar. The Spanish and the dispute got so bitter during the time that Robin and I were in Spain that the British clanged the gates of the border shut, and the border was sealed, and there was no communication between on land between Spain and Gibraltar. However, the runway that ran north and south was open to air traffic, but on certain kinds of wind conditions, you had to go over Spanish airspace to make the landing. And I was approached by Harold Macmillan's parliamentary private secretary on this. They said, we'll make a deal. If the Spanish would open the gates and extend that runway into Spain, they would bring the Spanish flag for the whole length of the runway into Gibraltar, in effect internationalizing the airport. This would have brought Spain and Gibraltar, Spain and the United Kingdom, into cooperation in operating an international airport, which would have benefited both countries. Now, it would require some mediation between the two countries to get this done. And I was encouraged by the Spanish to go back home and bring this up with Dean Rusk. Dean Rusk said, hold on a minute. We're in the middle of the Vietnam War. Our international obligations are full to overflowing. I'm not going to take on one more labor in this job. And I said, well, could I talk to the president about it? He said, fine, go ahead. So I went to LBJ and made the appointment with him. And I told him, sent word what I wanted to talk to him about. And he didn't receive me in the Oval Office. There's a little office off the Oval Office. It's a small little office. It just has a couch in it. And he and I sat down on that couch. And he said, what's on your mind? And as soon as I said the word Gibraltar, I could see the glaze of boredom go over his eyes. and the poor man had to listen to my 10 minutes of presentation, and I said we could really play a really important role in this historic dispute between these two two countries, if you would permit me to mediate between, or permit the Department of State to mediate between the two countries, I think we could open up the airport and get something going between Gibraltar and Spain. And he said, what does Dean Russ think? Dean says he's got enough to do, and he's not going to take on anything more. And he said, well, you straighten it out with Dean. And that was the end of it. Now, I don't know if that story answers your story, but there's one other one. LBJ was terribly concerned about the international presence in Vietnam. He wanted flags on the barricades of freedom, as he called it, in Vietnam. And I got an extraordinary amount of pressure on me personally to intervene with the Franco government to have them send a military contingent to Vietnam. Now, I'd go around and talk to the foreign minister. I'd talk to Munoz Grandes, who was the vice president of the government, and the defense minister. And no way were they going to send a military contingent. There's nothing in the Spanish national interest that would, but they wanted to be nice to us, and they wanted to do something for us. And they held out the possibility of sending a medical team. And Washington seized on that medical team, and I got a mountain of cables about when is the medical team going to arrive. The point about this, I couldn't put my heart and soul in it because I didn't believe in it much. I went through the motions of trying to get that medical team and the Spanish flag out to Vietnam, and I told this, I told this story to Chip Bolin, who was my colleague in Paris at the time, and I said, I'm being pressured terribly to get some damn fool medical team out to Vietnam. And he said, what does LBJ want with the tattered flag of fascism on the barricades of freedom? And that's how Chip characterized my efforts on that. But I might say I failed. I didn't get the medical team to Vietnam.
Let me ask two rather quick questions about internal administration in an embassy. What were your relations, if this is a proper question to ask, with the CIA?
Oh, honestly, you really hit some pretty good questions. I've got two things I'd like to tell you. One is, working for Stanton Griffiths was a tremendous educational experience. He was an extraordinary human being, but he hated the CIA. And in Buenos Aires, he said one of the first things he wanted to make clear is that he didn't want to read ever any of the trash that his CIA officers in the embassy turned out. Well, the chief of the CIA, the director of the CIA in the embassy, was a very good friend of mine. I mean, a particularly close personal friend. And I'd known him before, and as luck had it, he turned up to be there. So he said, and when the directive came down from the ambassador that he didn't want to ever read any trash from the CIA, my friend said, my career, my job is, I'm not doing my job. If the ambassador doesn't read any of my stuff, I'm in bad shape with Washington. I said, well, I got an idea for you. Now, you give me the most reliable, the things that the ambassador should see, and we'll incorporate them in the political officer's report. So I was also assigned to the political section. So in our weekly political summary of events in Argentina, I would have a page in there, unmarked, from my friend in the CIA that I put in our political section's briefing of the ambassador. And I just thought I'd tell you that story. The ambassador never knew it. So everybody was happy. I kept my CIA colleague happy because he was able to get what he thought were meaningful reports in, and the ambassador read them. Okay, that's one story on the CIA. The second thing was I always felt I had a good hold and handle on the CIA activities in my posts, except in Spain. Some rather unusual things happened that didn't have a logical explanation. Now, for instance, Fidel Castro had contracted for the construction of the most ultra-modern fishing vessels. They were about 130 feet long. They had refrigeration. They had all kinds of electronic gear. They were wonderful boats. They were built up in Galicia. Every time a boat was to be delivered to the Cuban authorities, a fire broke out. And for some unexplained reason, that boat never was delivered. It happened once, it happened twice, it happened 3 times. I called my CIA man in. I said, I don't quite understand what's going on here. I said, I'm awfully glad to read the papers about these boats burning up, but I'm not sure whether I ought to ask you, are you in on this? Are you fellas doing this or not? He said, Mr. Ambassador, I think that's a subject that you'd have to take up with Washington. I don't want you to put me on the spot here. And to tell you the truth, I didn't. I didn't. I felt my officers were telling me everything I ought to know. Now, I may have made a mistake. I possibly should, but I'm telling you that that story to let you know that I don't think that I knew everything that my CIA component was doing.
This may not be an appropriate question, but were you in favor or not in favor of allowing cover in the embassy for CIA people?
We had career CIA officers assigned to us in the embassy. I knew who they were. I worked with them. I thought they were doing a fine job.
Yeah.
Their main job was to keep in touch with the opposition elements to the Franco regime. They knew every socialist leader. They knew the communist leaders. They knew the anarchists. They knew the opposition church groups, the evangelicals. They knew the Jewish community. They knew the Muslim community. They were, to me, competent, bright people. Now, I don't know whom they employed outside or what cover there was. I didn't know. It's not my job to know. I didn't get into that. All I wanted to know is what was going on in the underground.
Yes. Final question, and perhaps this might be more appropriately directed to your lovely wife this afternoon, but during your many years as ambassador in different countries, there were great changes made in the status, rights, and privileges and responsibilities of women in the embassies by law, by regulation, and so forth. I wonder if you'd comment on this general question of the evolving status of women in the Foreign Service and in the embassies.
Well, please get my wife on it.
Yeah.
But let me comment on it from my point of view. I left, Robin and I left Denmark in the spring of 1969. Jimmy Carter called me back to be ambassador to Morocco 10 years later in 1979. It was a sea change, the difference between the status of women when I left and when I came back. In those 10 years, there was a revolution in the Foreign Service. I'll give you, from my point of view, every time Robin and I would have a significant dinner party for, let's say, Ted Kennedy. Ted Kennedy and his wife came to visit us in Madrid, and we would give a dinner party, and we wanted them to meet the most significant intellectuals, labor leaders, members of the establishment. So I would call a meeting of my staff, by that I mean the wives. We would meet 15 minutes before the dinner and more or less pass out assignments. Mrs. Political Officer, would you keep your eye on the foreign minister and his wife and make sure that Mrs. Kennedy meets them. The economic officer's wife, would you take care of, so on and so forth. The CIA director's wife, would you take care of this, that, and the other? And we would all parcel out our responsibilities before the 8 o'clock hour. And it was done 1, 2, 3, quickly. Everybody did their job, and it was terrific. When I went back to Morocco in '69, and I would ask the political officer and the commercial officer and so forth to come, the wives said, we'd be delighted to come, but we're not coming at 7:45. We're coming as your guests. And I didn't quite know what that meant. And I was quickly told that the wives are there to be as guests, and they are not on duty at the dinner at all. Not one bit. No. If they are to be on duty, they are to be compensated. And they are, again, they'd be delighted to come if wanted, but they come as guests. And there was no foolishness of getting assignments at the dinner. Now that was my first reaction. Robin could probably tell you more, but there was a new spirit of equality among the men and women of the staff.
What was the highest rank that any woman ever achieved in one of your embassies?
I had a commercial officer, a counselor for commercial affairs. I believe it was in Denmark. I never had a minister. Counselor of embassy was the highest ranking women. Women officers. We also had let's see, did I have a woman consul general? No, I bumped into many women consuls general, but I didn't have one, and I had women consuls, but I never had a woman consul general.
Did you have any married couples in your embassies?
They were all over the place when I came back in 1969, and I can't recall any married couple in Morocco, but I think we did have some junior officers who were married, yes. Mm-hmm. Wife and husband working in the embassy. Mm-hmm. I believe we did. Not of my senior officers.
Final question, what would you consider your most outstanding, important, memorable achievement as an ambassador?
Well, I think that Cy Vance called me to be ambassador to Morocco. I didn't know when he was talking to me. He said, I have an important job for you to do and a mission for you to do. We have a serious problem in Morocco, and I wonder if you could help me. I didn't know he meant ambassador. I thought I was going on a mission to do a job, but it turned out that it required me to take the post of ambassador, and there was two things that had to be done. One was to restore relations with the king. King had refused to speak to our ambassador for nearly a year, and that's a rather long story I won't go into, but in other words, to restore relations, personal ambassadorial relations with the king, which had been broken. And secondly, to determine whether or not the arms which Congress had permitted to be sold to Morocco could be delivered. My job was to determine if the king and the Moroccan government would negotiate with the Polisario. The congressional string on the sale, it's a $250 million arms sale. The condition was that the Moroccan government should engage in negotiations with the Polisario looking towards a peace treaty. And I did so when I presented my credentials and had my first talks with the king, we did the first thing. We restored personal good working relationship with the chief of state. That was the first job. The second job, the king had an extraordinary intelligence. He must have known what I was coming for, because before I could lay on him the condition, he said, I want to confide in you something that is a deep, deep secret and must be considered top secret. This is before I had a chance to enter into why I had come. He said, I want to let you know that at 3:30 this afternoon, my most trusted advisor, and he told me his name, is meeting in Geneva with the leadership of the Polisario to discuss negotiations and approaching peace. And he said, we are moving ahead to negotiate with the Polisario in an atmosphere of top secrecy, and no one must know this. Took all the wind out of my sails. I mean, I was going to go in and lay down the law, and he started the conversation that way. So I went back to the embassy, and I sent a telegram off to Washington outlining, and I believe I've got this cable in the files here at Duke University, in which I said, we have a choice to make here. Do we believe the king and proceed with the sale of the arms, or do we say we demand further proof? So I sent the cable, and as a result, Cy Vance asked me to come back and discuss it. So I came back and discussed it with the Assistant Secretary of State, Hal Saunders, and then with Cy Vance, and many others, the head of INR in the department. And the question was, what was in the national interest? What was in the best interest to do? To take the king at his word and go ahead with the sale, or to demand further proof? And finally, after all due consideration, in considering our national interests and the problems going on that were emerging with Spain, we must have an alternative airspace for the routes of the protection of the Mediterranean and our access to Israel. Morocco was the alternative to Spain, and it always had to be kept open in terms of the Spanish negotiations. And so it was decided to take the king at his word, and the sale went through. And the interesting thing from a point of view of detail, the check for $250 million was made out by the Saudi government and handed over to the United States Treasury without going through the Moroccan hands. And when Jimmy Carter lost the election, and I had sent in my routine resignation, I got a very nice letter message from Secretary Haig asking me when I wanted to be relieved, which was quite a nice way of putting it. Most of them say, come home at once. But this was a nice cable saying, when do you think is the right time for you to come back? And I said, I don't think I should come until the first plane is delivered under the terms of this $250 million sale. So as it happened, the first F-14 was delivered in mid-March 1981, and I stayed for that delivery and then went home. Now, I don't know if that was the most momentous thing that happened, but it's the one that's freshest in my mind.
Yeah.
And now we turn to John Topaski, who is an expert in much of the history you've been speaking of, but especially of Spain.
Mr. Duke, I'd like to ask you first about your service in Argentina, where you started your diplomatic career. You came to Argentina in a very difficult time. Relations were not very good with Argentina so far as the United States was concerned. Can you comment on that?
Yes. Harry Truman sent Stanton Griffiths down there as really a special ambassador to try to improve the relationship between Argentina and the United States. And Griffiths felt that he had the capacity, the ability, and the key. And one of the things he always felt was to establish human and personal relations. He'd been, as I say, ambassador to Egypt beforehand and to Poland, and he was determined to establish a close personal relationship with President and Mrs. Perón. And he took a good deal of care in the selection of the personal gifts that he would bring them. And I remember one of my jobs was to find a poodle dog, and I helped find a small miniature gray poodle, which he brought down on the ship with him. I flew down to Buenos Aires, and when he came in to present his credentials, he presented President Perón with a $20 gold piece as a personal gift, and he said that he wanted to present the dog to the First Lady, and so he made an appointment, and which was outside of protocol because ambassadors don't call on First Ladies, but he arranged to deliver the dog personally to La Señora de Perón, and established a working relationship and a bond with her in that way.
What were your perceptions of what the regime was like? It was an anomaly. It was a totalitarian regime of the right at a time when the right had been, fascism had been discredited by World War II. But what kind of regime?
It was a populist regime. It was a government to overturn the old order, the established order of Argentina, which was based on a landowning class. The estancieros of Argentina had largely dominated the government, which had been until the early 1930s democratically elected or popularly elected. But the Peronismo at that particular time was a populist type of demagogic authoritarianism, giving order, stability, authority from the populist right. And the atmosphere was one of mass rallies and that type of demagogic democracy. The revolutionary figure inside the Peronist establishment was Eva Perón, who was a truly bitter, dedicated revolutionary. She was a believer in the class war. She was a believer in the overturn of the established order and of the society. She was a bitter opponent of the oligarchy.
Yet she presented the image of an elegant woman, fur-bedecked and jewels and fine clothing.
That was a phase. When she was a poor woman, came from a very poor, impoverished, hard background. She came from the streets. And the first instinct was to surround herself with the luxuries of life. And she was a smart gal. She was 24 years old when she became First Lady of Argentina. And for the first couple of years, she did have furs and jewels and so forth, but she quickly understood the reality of power is not in the appurtenance of power. And as she grew older, by the time I got to know her, she was 28. She never wore a jewel. She had no makeup. She was very good looking. She had plain, unadorned hair, and she was a Charlotte Corday. She imagined herself as sort of a Joan of Arc, and she had come through if you might call it, the purification process of the revolutionary ethic, and had come through to be a dedicated, I won't say Marxist, because the Marxists rejected her because she wasn't educated. But she was a true revolutionary and a dedicated hater of the world in which she was brought up.
You went to Spain directly after your service in Argentina.
Yes,
with,
and you're a
Ambassador
Hispanicist, and I want to tell you about my ignorance. I loved Argentina. I loved the assignment, the 2 years that I spent there. I felt very much at home. I got to understand the world I lived in, and when I received the news of the transfer to Spain, I felt I was overjoyed. I felt I was moving in the Hispanic world from one room in the same house to another. How wrong I was. I was moving from the New World to the Old. I was moving from America to Europe. And Spain is a European society. It's not an American society. It's not a Spanish-American world. It's an entirely different thing, and I had to throw out all my illusions.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that again, it's as different. It's as different from Spain is as different from Argentina as England is from Chicago or America, and the United States. It's tremendously different.
Both were in totalitarian regimes. Was that a difference as well? Was there a difference in the kind of repression?
Tremendously different. Argentina was a popular authoritarian government based upon demagoguery. There was no foolishness like that. There was no populism in Francoism. His was an iron-fisted military state, and there was no there were no street demonstrations. There were no balcony strutting. This was a police state, and no foolishness about popular support.
We'll go back to Spain a bit later. From Spain, you went to El Salvador as ambassador.
I was in El Salvador first.
Right.
Let me see. Correction. I beg your pardon. I was thinking of my second time in Spain. No, I went from Spain as a political appointee to as ambassador to El Salvador.
What did that experience do for you, and how do you look upon the El Salvador experience as ambassador?
Well,
as your first
I must
ambassadorial post?
It was a quantum leap from being second secretary and consul with 2 posts behind me to jump to being chief of mission. But fortunately for my education, it was to El Salvador, which at that time was a peaceful country, developing on its road to economic and political development, and a country of 4 million people, something around 10,000 square miles, a country that you could motor from the northern border of Honduras to the sea in a little over 2 hours. You could motor from one end of the country to another in a little over 6 hours. And in 6 months, I could play tennis with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the Vice President I'd have breakfast with. I'd see the President go boating with him over weekends. One could see how that country operated, and I learned the practice of government in a way that would be impossible in a larger country.
A microcosm.
And it was a microcosm of how any country operates, and served me very well every other country I went to afterwards.
I have a couple questions that are maybe inappropriate.
No, please.
You were appointed ambassador to Spain in 1965, and you had to leave the office of chief of protocol. Were you happy to do that?
Well, the answer was yes, I was very happy to leave it. Looking back on that now, I think I was a bit foolish to be so happy, because when you're at the center of power and you really are as chief of protocol. You're in the eye of the storm. You're at the side of the president. You're, if not part of history, you certainly are witnessing it. And I'd always, my lifetime ambition had been to be ambassador to Spain. And when I got there, I found that I was moving from the center of the action into the countryside. I mean, away from where the action was. And it was, frankly, to move to a dictatorship after the hurly-burly of the White House years, in many ways, is very disappointing.
Just going back a bit, were you happy to be appointed as chief of protocol?
I had a prejudice against being chief of protocol, and when President Kennedy asked me, and I hesitated, he said, "What's on your mind?" I said, "Well, gosh, Senator, I was very anxious to be a chief of mission in Latin America again, and I don't know much about it." Well, he said, "What have you got against it?" I said, "Well, the worst thing I think I have against it is its name." And he said, "Well, for God's sakes, if that's all you have against it, change it." I said, "How do you mean?" He said, "Well, get together with Dean Rusk, and if you don't like the name, find something else." So I didn't know Dean. He was the head of the Rockefeller Foundation at the time, and didn't know him except I'd seen him speak at the Council of Foreign Relations. I'd met him. So I told him that the president-elect had asked me to get in touch with him, and could I have lunch with him? He said, "Sure." So we went to the State Department cafeteria, and I told him of the conversation I'd had with JFK, and Dean Rusk was totally open-minded. He said, "Well, if you don't like," he said, "it's a great job." He said, "It really is a great job." He said, "You could have leadership in that job and do things with that job that's never been done before if you take it. Now, your problem is with the name. Okay, let's fool around. The chief of protocol ranks with and is an assistant secretary of state." I like that. That has a nice resonance to it. So we fooled around with assistant secretary of state. Assistant secretary of state for White House liaison? No. Ceremonial affairs? No. Okay, we tried for the best part of that luncheon period to find a better name for it, and by golly, we couldn't do it. So Dean came up with an idea. He said, "How about chief of protocol with the rank of ambassador?" I said, "Well, that sounds pretty good." It always tacitly, implicitly had that, but it was never spelt on the commission before. So with that, I said, "Okay, I'll do it." And it was put on my commission.
When you went back to Spain, did you notice many changes from your days there in the early 50s?
The most extraordinary change was economic. When I was there in the early 50s, Spain was celebrating its millionth tourist, and it was an enormously poor country. It was, an impoverished country. I'll give you one horrible example. I played golf with one of the aristocratic members of the establishment at the Puerto de Hierro, the best golf club there, and he had a tassel on his tee. He would put the ball down on the tee, and that tee was the only tee he had, and he had a long tassel on it, and that was one thing. Just to give you some idea, when we got off the golf course, he gave a 5-centavo piece, which is worth about a quarter, I guess, to the caddy. And the caddy looked at it. It was an insulting thing to do, and looked at it, unhappy at receiving a 5-cent tip. And my golf partner said, "We won the war."
Did you
that gives you some of the atmosphere of the time.
What were your perceptions of General Franco at that time?
Franco was the most uncharacteristic dictator you ever saw in your life. He was a short man with a white face, mottled, jowled, fishy eyes, a very limp handshake, big pot belly, and yet at the same time, quite an impressive personality. He had evidently enormous reserves of power inside of him, and you knew that you were in the presence of a very intelligent person, but he was not, again, a populist, a strutter, a demagogue of any kind. If I could put it in, he was an intellectual of a certain type, a very interesting person, but a impossible person to penetrate. I remember taking Dean Rusk to see him once at the El Pardo Palace. This had to do with the renegotiation of the base agreements, and they had a very strained conversation in which I sat in on. It was long pauses. He was a very difficult person to communicate with, but and Dean was taxed to his full extent of his capabilities to handle the situation. And we came out, we got in the car and drove away in silence, thinking over this interview, and drove back to Madrid through the night. And Dean said to him, he said, God, that man has changed since I've seen him last. And then he looks awful. And then he waited for a minute and he said, but I wonder how I look to him.
There were rumors in Spain at that time of the bad health of the Generalissimo, and that his wife Carmen Polo was playing an increasing role in making sure that he had audiences only at the right time and so on. Did you know her well? Or
Carmen Polo was Mrs. Franco, la Senora de Franco. Now she's the Duquesa Viuda de Franco. She was a charming woman, is a charming woman. Very charming, very intelligent, very attractive person, warm and friendly. The Generalissimo never exercised, and he didn't appear to be what you call a health-conscious person. He always looked unhealthy and pallid, and he, again, I recall very much a very painful luncheon we had when the Chrysler Corporation opened their branch in Spain, a huge manufacturing branch. They formed a partnership with Barreros, which was a local motor vehicle manufacturer. And the Chrysler board came over to Spain, the president and the chairman of the board, and in a true ceremonial way to celebrate the occasion, they had a shoot, a portrait shoot. And in the middle of the shoot, the big ceremonial luncheon. And Franco, the Generalissimo, sat on one side of the table, and he had the chairman of Chrysler on his right and the president of Chrysler on his left. I, as the American ambassador, sat opposite him, and it was a narrow table. And I had Carmencita Franco, his daughter, on my right, and I believe the French ambassador on my left, because the French had a stock interest in the Barreros company. And the point of my story is, he never spoke once during the whole luncheon. And you know, these two American corporate leaders, after the initial perhaps 15 minutes of deference to the chief of state, began talking over him. And it was quite funny because they would talk back and forth over this statuesque figure of a person who remained absolutely silent. And he didn't participate. Of course, he didn't speak English, but he just didn't communicate or care to communicate. He was above it all.
you mentioned earlier Don Juan, the Count of Barcelona,
Yes.
the pretender who never took his throne. The son took his throne. Did you know him at all? Did you?
Well, I told you I met him when I was 17 years old. We went shooting for 2 days, and I formed an enormous, if I may use the word, affection, but certainly I was very interested in him. He was outshone by his father, Alfonso XIII, who was a charismatic human being. Don Juan was much more the respectful son, but also he was very English. He reminded me of an English country gentleman, and he had been educated in the English schools. He'd been in the Royal Navy, and his manner and the way he handled himself was, to me, much more English than Latin, let's say. So over the years, I kept in touch with him in various ways. And I saw him in New York when he came to New York, for example. So when I came back to Spain in 1965, he was living in Estoril in Portugal. And my wife and I went over and, to stay with the American ambassador in Portugal, who arranged for me to call on Don Juan. So once I had done that, I made it a practice of going and doing that every 6 months to get his opinion of the Franco regime, the future, and to give some idea of the contacts of the people that he was seeing, because he was treated as the chief of state in exile, and all the opposition leaders and all the government leaders would all go over and confer with him. But the reason why he was unacceptable was that he was an outspoken and a Democrat. He believed in a parliamentary system of government and wanted his son to be brought up, educated in the parliamentary and democratic tradition, which he could do up until the university level. And then we could go into that, what happened after that. But the answer is yes, I kept in touch, close touch with Don Juan.
Was he bitter about not being able to assume the throne?
He was a man who would be he wouldn't show his feelings. So you could only picture his feelings. I think he was more concerned about the future of the dynasty and of Spain, and he honestly was objective enough to be able to analyze politically the most astute thing to do. And I think that he would regard himself as disposable if it had to be. But he didn't want to be disposed of. He wanted to be a player in the game. It was he who had to abdicate in order for his son to assume the legitimate succession after the death of Franco. It wasn't just the government that put Juan Carlos in place. It was his father, because he couldn't have done it legitimately without his father's abdication, and he had never abdicated. He never abdicated until after Franco's death.
Now, that brings us to his son, the present King of Spain,
Right.
Juan Carlos. Do you know him, and would you like to comment on his role as...
I knew him since he was a boy. He came and visited me in Southampton when he was 17 or 18 years old, and stayed in my house. This was long before I went to Spain in 1965. When we got to Madrid, I also had taken him and Princess Sophia, as she was then, to meet with President Kennedy, who was absolutely delighted with them both. We all had a very good time together. Not only did I know him personally, but I knew him officially. So I brought him to the White House, he and Princess Sophia, and introduced him to the Kennedys, the President and Ms. Kennedy, and so forth. So when I came to Spain, Robin and I called on them, and I used to call on him in the mornings about once a month. I would go and see him. I saw him, well, at least 6 times a year, sometimes 10 times a year, towards the end about once a month. And he used to tell me about his relations with the chief of state and the kind of tests that the Franco would put him through. And I remember one morning I was having coffee with him at the Zarzuela Palace, it's called. It's really a large country house on the outskirts of Madrid. And he said that that morning, it was his practice every Friday morning to call on the chief of state at 9 o'clock in the morning for instructions about what to do the following week. That morning, I called on him about 11, and he'd made his call on the Generalissimo, and he said, but that morning things were different. The protocol officer who had met him escorted him to a double door in the El Pardo Palace. That's where Franco lived. The door swung open, and as he entered the room, the protocol officer said, His Excellency the Chief of State wants you to preside at the cabinet meeting today. Now, he'd had no notice, no idea, and the Chief of State wanted to see how this 20-year-old boy would handle himself. So I said, sir, what did you do? He said, I took my seat at the head of the table and I asked for the agenda. And I said, how did it go? He said, I think it went pretty well.
In the 60s, when you were ambassador, Juan Carlos was viewed very much as a puppet of Franco and very much as a joke. Do you think that was a fair assessment?
No, I don't think it was a fair assessment, because I think that he was learning. He was an observer. He was a man watching how government operates, watching how the chief of state conducts himself, how he conducts himself. He was getting into the substance of it going on. He was not a player. He was a student of government, and he was there to absorb everything that was going on. It was not for him to express an opinion or have an idea. He was there to learn, and he learned an awful lot. Very few people have ever been given the opportunity to see government work at close hand the way he did. And I think he picked up a lot. And don't forget the training and the imprint of his father on his thinking. He was a rather detached personality, watching how this state operated from the inside. And then when Franco died, his ideas could come out. He could express himself with all the knowledge of how a government operates. And so he didn't really come to life until he could operate himself.
You yourself were a very popular ambassador in Spain. You were well liked by the Spanish people, got favorable press. And we talked earlier, though, about the Palomares incident, the nuclear accident in the Mediterranean. One morning when I woke up and got the morning paper, ABC, I saw your picture on the front of that related to the incident at Palomares. Could you describe what went on and the reason for that picture?
Well, that was in
bathing in the Mediterranean.
Right, that was in January 1966. Two planes, refueling planes, of the Strategic Air Force, the SAC planes, were flying. This was those planes that were going over the borders of the Soviet Union. And the job of the Spanish, our U.S. Air Force contingent in Spain was to send up a tanker, gasoline tanker, to refuel as it came over Spain. They missed the connection, a spark went off, the tanker exploded in the air, and it blew the bottom of the other B-52 bomber off, and 4 atom bombs were released and fell. 2 fell on land, 2 fell in the sea. I knew at once, as soon as it happened, I knew we were in for real serious trouble. I went immediately to the Foreign Office and flew down to the site. We had our military cordoned off the area, and they found 1 bomb on the beach, unbroken, sealed, okay, retrieved it. The other bomb broke open, released plutonium into an area, and they sent teams out to Washington to define the plutonium area. The 2 others that fell in the sea A day later, they found one of them in shallow water, unbroken, and the fourth one was lost. And as time went by, the presence of that nuclear weapon off the coast in the Mediterranean caused serious problems for Spain in the international world. For instance, citrus products going into Germany had to be examined for radiation. The Germans would not buy fruit that they thought had been contaminated, possibly by radiation. Speakers arose in the House of Commons to ask the Prime Minister whether it was safe for British tourists to go to Spain and subject themselves to radiation. The Soviet Union began a campaign in the United Nations for the international search and recovery, a UN search and recovery mission to find the fourth bomb, which would have brought the Soviet Navy closer to the Spanish shores, photographing the bottom of the Mediterranean, and all sorts of complications. Something had to be done. I mean, there wasn't much you could do while the Navy was out there looking for that bomb. So I came up with the idea of going swimming with my wife and my children in the waters where the bomb fell to prove that it was safe and that the contamination, if I could take my children in swimming and go in myself and my wife would go with me, why, obviously it couldn't be all that dangerous. So I proposed this to the Minister of Information and Tourism, Manolo Fraga Iribarne, and who today is the president of the autonomous region of Galicia, by the way. He survived the Franco period. But Fraga was very suspicious of the idea, didn't like it, thought it was undignified. I asked him to come with me. I said, we could together prove that it was safe. He said, oh no, I couldn't do that. It would be an undignified thing. I'd get in a bathing suit. He thought it was very undignified. But then he thought it over and called me back and he said, well, I tell you what, we're going to open a parador, that's a government inn, down in that area, and we could open that inn with a ceremony, and if you wanted to go swimming, it would be logical. So the point is, that decision assumed a life of its own. We released it to the press. We were going to open the parador and go swimming. And the day came, which is a couple of days later, there were 1,000 newsmen from all over the world watching. And then, but going down on the plane, we also heard that that it would be inadvisable for my wife to go in because it would take away from, I don't know what you might call it, some idea of the Spanish dignity of the situation, or cheesecake, or whatever it might be, to have this beautiful woman in a bikini or something. So they decided to eliminate my wife from the story. And so Fraga and I went in, and my children came in afterwards. But it was that story that you saw. And frankly, it worked. It broke the spell.
And it defused.
And it defused the issue.
Just finally, I'd like to talk about your leaving Spain, and you went from Spain to Denmark, I understand.
Yes. I went from Spain back to, that's a complicated story, but I'd really rather like to tell you about it. If you read LBJ's autobiography, you will find that he says he made the decision not to run in 1969, 68. He decided not to run in October of 1967. I was sitting in my embassy on January 6th, 1968, accompanied by J. Rutherford, who was then representing an American newspaper, and some other American newspaper men, at dinner. And the president got me on the phone and said, I want you to come back and be at my side when I run next November. When can you come back? I said, Mr. President, I'm in the middle of the negotiations of the Spanish base agreements. He said, when does that terminate? I said, next September. He said, oh, well, you've got to come back before, got to come back. I said, well, what could I say? He said, I want you to be my chief of protocol, and I want you to be at my side when I run again. So, when can you get there? So I had a lot to do. I said, April 1st. He said, fine, report for duty on April 1st. So Robin and I put off our departure. There was an awful lot of despedidas, farewells, and calls, and all the business of winding things up. And we left on March 31st on a military aircraft and flew from Madrid to Washington. Got there exhausted, went to the Watergate Hotel, ordered dinner in our room, had it up, sent by room service, and turned on the TV. The president was to speak at 8 o'clock that night. And when he came on the screen, I was being sworn in the next day. It was at that time he said that he wasn't going to run again. So I'd come all the way home and gotten there the day before he pulled out of the race. So that was how I left Spain. Now he never mentioned this to me. His wife, he didn't show up for my swearing in. Mrs. Johnson came to that. And he must have known how disappointed I was to be pulled out of the negotiations and to be pulled off a job that I felt I was doing something worthwhile in, to come back to a job that I'd rather pleased to have left. And I'd like my wife to tell you the story of what she and he said about my appointment to Denmark. Let's leave that till another time.
Leave that till
But I stayed 6 months and before I went to Denmark.
Well, thank you, John. Think about John Fitzgerald Kennedy, young president, Catholic, out of Harvard University that you knew about and you were with. How would you evaluate him as President of the United States?
Well, I consider him, if I may be accused of a bit of hyperbole here, I think he was the hope of our country and the hope of mankind. I think he was potentially the greatest president we've had, certainly since Franklin Roosevelt, but perhaps even greater than that. I think he was a man who was growing. He came into office as a young man. I saw him grow in front of my eyes. I saw him face the situation, matured in the Bay of Pigs. I saw him come to life in the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was a man capable to meet challenges as they arose, and he became bigger and bigger and better all the time. He was growing, growing, growing.
And was there a downside of him?
Of course there are downsides. I mean, to me, there's no such thing as the Kennedys. There's no such thing as the Kennedys. I'm talking about John F. Kennedy, a great man. Yeah. Now, when you say the Kennedys, you're thinking of the popular side relationships with women, we'll say. John Kennedy had a sense of priorities. He could place women, and he was learning to do it better and better all the time, in the proper place in life. His relationships with his wife was getting better and better all the time. They were getting closer. Everything was falling into place. His family life was good and getting better. His priorities in the presidency were superb. If he had gotten a mandate in 1964, we would never have gone into Vietnam.
Oh.
The whole history of our country would have been entirely different.
Is it for sure that right before he was assassinated that he was working to end the Vietnam crisis?
Well, you see, everything I say about this is personal and verbal, and I cannot authenticate. But I do recall, and I've said this, I think, for the record. several times. I had a particular conversation about the strategy and what the policy of the president would be in 1964 if he got a popular mandate. He had 15,000 American advisors, troops soldiers in Vietnam. He was fascinated by the British success in Malaysia, the tactics of the commando units in Malaysia. He would be willing to try that in Vietnam, but he was very persuaded by General Ridgway that the United States could never win a land war in Asia. And he was an advocate of that point of view. He was very persuaded to that end. And the idea was, if he got a mandate, that he would convert entirely to a guerrilla-type operations, but would never enter into a massive land effort, and that actually withdrawal would be the better course of action. Yeah. So this is a conversation I had with Kenny O'Donnell, his chief of staff, telling me, and I think it was General McHugh was with me too, we were just batting the breeze in the White House one day, and he was outlining what would happen. Now, unfortunately, the conversation was not taped. There's nothing written down about it, but I can only say, to the best of my recollection, the chief of staff and I, and unfortunately Kenny O'Donnell's dead now. So I'm afraid you'll have to depend upon my own recollection.
Well, that's fascinating. You know, there is one report that Kennedy actually had started to withdraw troops from Vietnam.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah,
I wouldn't be surprised at all. I know that he was very, he was horrified by the death of Jim. He was horrified. He had a feeling about fellow Catholic chiefs of state, both wanting to keep arm's length and keep carefully correct with them, at the same time very interested. Yeah. I mean, I once had a conversation with him coming from, we were in the Azores, coming back from, I believe it was the trip to Berlin, and he said, I'd been 2 years with him, and he said, what do you want after another year? And I said, I'd like to go ambassador to Spain. He said, I'd never send a friend of mine to a Catholic dictatorship. He said, I'd send a career officer. I wouldn't send you there. I wouldn't send a friend of mine there.
Well, and you think from the Bay of Pigs to the Cuban Missile Crisis,
this fella grew.
Yeah.
He grew. Came to life. And he was capable of meeting challenges always. I mean, he was escalating in his powers all the time. I could contrast it to LBJ, who was a massive, tremendous giant of a human being, who came from being the majority leader of the Senate into the White House very comfortably and easily. He didn't grow a hair's breadth in the job. I mean, he was a big man, and he remained a big man, but he didn't get any bigger, whereas Kennedy was growing all the time.
Could you tell us of your relationships with him early on?
Well, we had a couple of things that he would try out on me. One of the things he asked me to do was to see what we could do to differentiate his relationship between Latin American democratically elected leaders and the dictators. And he asked me to see what I could do in terms of formula. And I did put it down on paper. I gave him a paper saying that I didn't think that anything could be changed in Washington. The careful minuet of White House lunches or dinners, going to the other embassies, the amount of time the president gave, you couldn't distinguish in Washington. But outside of Washington, here you have your father's house on this strip of land stretching out towards Latin America between the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea, and this beautiful old Spanish-style house and a swimming pool. Why don't you, after the official visit's over, why don't you ask Betancourt, Munoz Marin, Figueres of Costa Rica, to stop over and have a barbecue around the pool on their way home. And I put it in good language, but that was the idea of it. In other words, you go through the state and official visit, then on the way home, you give them some home hospitality at your father's house down there in Florida. He loved it. Thought it was a great idea. He said, try it out on Tom Mann. Tom Mann was our Assistant Secretary of State for Latin America. Tom Mann shot it down so hard and fast it didn't even get off the ground. He said, you cannot do that. You can't show preference from one over the other. And it was early enough in the administration that he had to accept the judgment of the career officer who was in charge of Latin America. And so that idea. But it was fun to, as I say, to work for him to come up with ideas. The other one, another one, was on the civil rights matter. He, in the year 1962, the Third World, particularly Africa, exploded into independence. 33 countries created a new flag, sent their man to the UN, and went to see President Kennedy. Those were the attributes of sovereignty, really were. I mean, you had to have a UN ambassador, you had to have a flag. Some countries didn't bother with anthems. The Congo, for instance, didn't have a national anthem. We had to play waltz music when the President of Congo came, but that's another story. Point is, these people came to Washington, but it wasn't safe for an African ambassador to set up a mission in Washington because we had segregated real estate. So he asked me, would you make it safe? Would you desegregate our nation's capital so that an ambassador can buy a house and get an office and go to a restaurant and go to a hotel? Well, that was my job as chief of protocol, was to make it safe for African ambassadors to set up shop in our capital.
Now, was that early on?
That was 1963.
63.
Yeah. And I must tell you, it was an easy job. I went to Morris Kafritz, who was the chairman of the Real Estate Board of Washington, and I said, now Morris, are we going to have trouble? Because if we're going to have trouble here, we'll get legislation that will crack this city open. But if you real estate people will open up and sell land and houses for embassies and desegregate office space, he said, I'll call, you speak to the real estate board. So he called a meeting of the real estate board. I promise you, in 1 hour, they all agreed. I mean, it sounds easy, but it was. In just about 1 day, that policy changed. Then I had to go to the Hotel Association of Washington, and they gave up. They surrendered right away. The Restaurant Association. Washington was the, I'm making it easy, but in a funny way it was. Once you had the power of the presidency behind you, and you could go and you could say this is in the national interest, is our capital going to be safe for diplomats of all nations or not? If it's not, tell me, and we're going to do something about it. Okay, it worked.
But you made that happen. That shows what you could do. That was different from the barbecue lunch, but
yeah.
Really,
I could do that.
Really made this happen, and that was a real change in Washington, was it not?
But that's why it was, may I say, fun, interesting, exciting to work for President Kennedy.
Yeah. Now, and you think that if he had lived and been reelected, we might have had one of the best presidents ever.
First of all, we never would have had Vietnam in the form we had it. We just wouldn't have. And can you think what Vietnam has done to our psyche? How it's affected us as a people. We still are traumatized by Vietnam. And we wouldn't have had Vietnam if JFK had been reelected president.
What was your experience at the death of Kennedy? Were you in the country then and so forth?
I was with my brother Tony, at a restaurant in Washington when a waiter came up to the table and said, President Kennedy has been shot. I could only say to myself, shot at. And I went on with the lunch. But he came back and said, no, wait a minute, now it's serious. So with that, I pulled myself together and got in a taxi and went back to the State Department, to my office. And to my rage, not just horror, but my rage, I saw the figure of the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, who was Sevilla Sacasa, the Nicaraguan ambassador, in a sort of an unctuous, sympathetic, mealy-mouthed greeting to me, extending his sympathy. I said, sympathy for what? What do you mean? I mean, I wouldn't accept it, if you follow what I'm saying. I would not accept what I didn't quite understand or hear. I didn't know much, but to have the Dean of the Corps extending his sympathy before I got the news, I was just furious at him. And he said he would like to sign the book. I said, there is no book, and in effect, will you kindly get lost? I mean, I was really upset.
Yeah.
And get out of my way. And I went in the office, and I got the news. The president was dead.
Yeah.
And I pulled myself together, got this stupid man, and I said, come back in here. And I got some paper and let him sign his sympathy note, and I apologized.
Yeah.
And pulled myself together. And then I went upstairs to George Ball, who was acting Secretary of State, because Dean Rusk was over the Pacific on his way to Japan. And George and I pulled our thoughts together what we had to face in terms of the international community and the international responsibilities. And he asked me to frame a cable to all the chiefs of state in the world, telling them, and this is something that he and I discussed, that they should not come to the funeral. We thought this was the best way. We thought this should be an American tribute to an American president. And he said, now we got to get this cable straight. We have to have it cleared with the Kennedy family. We have to have it cleared with the new president. We have to have it cleared all through the government. But when you get the Deputy Secretary of State for Political Affairs, Nick Katzenbach, who's a lawyer, you get downstairs to his office and draft this cable. So I went down to Nick's office, and we carefully put together a cable to all the chiefs of state in the world, saying, would they appoint their ambassadors as representatives to the ceremonies which were to take place the following Monday. Well, by that time, we got that cable cleared. The President Magsaysay of the Philippines, or was it Macabagao, had already set out. The Emperor of Ethiopia had left. And when de Gaulle heard that Haile Selassie left, he sent us a cable. So almost before our cable left, we were getting cables coming in telling us who was coming. So the cable went out, but it was a dead issue by the time it arrived around the world because it took so long to clear.
That's fascinating. And then you went to his funeral.
Well, I was in charge of the funeral.
You were in charge of the funeral?
I was in charge of it, of the whole ceremonial aspect of the funeral.
I see.
And I set up my office in the White House. The chairman of the task force that was the White House task force on the funeral was Sergeant Shriver, who was responsible to Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy was sat on the second floor and directed the family policy on the funeral. Sergeant Shriver was the operations officer, and I was the government man in charge of the funeral. And I can tell you, I could write a book about that funeral. Just all the things from the appearance of Vice President Nixon to my wife could tell you what General de Gaulle did to her. But perhaps one of the most poignant stories was at the reception afterwards, Mrs. Joseph Kennedy came up to me and said that she was very interested in meeting and talking to the president, to the Emperor of Ethiopia, and could I arrange for her to see him? So I said, fine, Mrs. Kennedy, you go up and sit on that little bench outside the elevator on the second floor of the White House and wait for me there. And I went and found the emperor and told him that Mrs. Kennedy would like to see him, and I took him up on the elevator, sat him down on this little bench, and and I stayed there until the conversation got started. And she said, you know, sir, she said, you and I have two things in common. And she said, we're the same age, you and I. And secondly, we've both lost our sons in tragic events. Your son, the Duke of Harrar, was killed 4 years ago. And I couldn't stay any longer, so I drifted away. But I was so flabbergasted. She would know his age, and she would know about the death of the Duke of Harrar, his son. I mean, I just tell you, those are the kinds of things that happened during the funeral. I got one more thing, because I'm conscious of my wife's great role in that funeral, because she had taken care of, with me, of Marshal Tito, who'd been in the United States, who'd suffered a serious assassination attempt at the Waldorf Astoria while we were there, and he was very bitter about security arrangements here. And he had a foreign minister, I think his name was Popovich, who was with him at the time. And Adlai Stevenson, it so happened, was spit upon by crowds in Dallas. And Tito showed us, what kind of a country is this when Croatian Ustashi terrorists can penetrate to the 36th floor of the Waldorf, which they did, and your ambassador to the United Nations, candidate for president of the United States, is spit upon by your own people. What kind of a country is this? All right, the point is about the funeral. When Popovich came through the line at the funeral, he turned to my wife and said, what did I tell you? In other words, well, he was with Tito, and they were talking about Tito's attempted assassination. He said, we told you.
That happened.
I mean, those are the things that happened at the funeral. I introduced Prince Philip to De Valera. De Valera said the British had put me in prison for 2 years. I've never met a member of the royal family. I said, would you like to meet him? Meet one? He said, fine. And so I went and talked to the Duke of Edinburgh and said, would you like to meet this old revolutionary? He said, I'd love to. So I put the two of them together. I mean, my point is the funeral was not only the funeral of the death of American hopes, which I think it was for a long time to come. I don't see the country would, it'll be a long time before we recover from the death of President Kennedy. But so much happened at the funeral itself. So many interesting things.
Well, Angie, you know that funeral was a major experience of the whole nation. Everyone in the country virtually was watching what you designed there and was very much affected by it. So I think that's a very important activity that you undertook. It could have been much worse than it was. It was a very significant experience for all of us. Well, then the nation moved to Lyndon Baines Johnson. And as you pointed out previously, a different president, a president not so much growing but being
Yes.
in a way.
He was a big man.
Yeah. How would you evaluate him, and tell us about your experience with him?
Well, LBJ was a great leader. He was a dynamic and a powerful personality with very strong opinions in the civil rights field, human rights field. He was a populist in the best sense, really, a man who really honestly believed in the well-being of all the people. And he was a fighter for that, and he was very effective. He used the executive power of the United States in a way that probably has never been used before or since. He was extremely effective. Where he was out of his depth and where he was in the unknown was in international affairs. And frankly, He didn't want to be the first American president to withdraw from a challenge. He didn't want to back down and so forth, and he didn't know how to handle it. He was out of his depth in the international waters, but a great man for the great society, and we made great advances under LBJ domestically. And it's terrible that he was brought down and that he brought himself down in the Vietnam issue. Well, I want to tell you some of the, if I may use the word, crudities of LBJ in international relations. The first state visit that he had after his being sworn in as president was the president of Italy, who came in, I believe it was February of 1965. And the president laid great store of the Italian vote. This was a very symbolic thing for him to have the panoply of a great state visit with the president of Italy. Well, the president of Italy came, and it developed in the course of conversation in the meetings in the White House in the cabinet room that the president really didn't know that the president of Italy is a ceremonial figure. Because when he asked him to discuss NATO, the Italian president said, "I can't discuss NATO. That is not my function. You'll have to discuss that with the head of government." And it turned out, and he became, the more he talked, the more the two of them talked, the more disappointed LBJ was in the circumstances of this visit. And I really mean, and I never could tell, but I could tell by his attitude that he was very disappointed not to be able to talk substance with this fine old ceremonial gentleman who occupied the post of president. But the way I got into it, rather in a difficult way, was when the president got bored in doing this interminable translation between when he spoke, the translator, this, that, and the other, and came back. So when they were translating to the Italian president, the president reached up under his desk, picked up a phone, and said, get me Bob McNamara on the phone. So I had a yellow pad, and I wrote on the pad, "Mr. President, you cannot talk on the telephone when you are in a meeting with the Italian president." I folded it, and I stuck it up in front of him. He opened it, and I could see the red go right. It got beet red in fury, you see. And closed it up, hung up the phone. "Duke, see you after this meeting." And then there's another funny thing. I'm talking about his awkwardness.
Well, excuse me, what did he say to you after the meeting?
He said, "I'll see you after this meeting."
Yeah.
So anyway, then we went on with the meeting, and the color began to come back to his face, meaning he began to get control of him. So he was absolutely furious at me.
Yeah.
But he hung up the phone. And so afterwards, he always depended upon me as to whether to bring the visitor to the door. You bring the head of governments to the door, and you bring a chief of state to the car. And so it's a bit longer walk, and he didn't quite know which one it was. So anyway, I walked him through the White House, the two presidents, and they chatted between them and put the president of Italy in the car, banged the door shut, and then the two of us walked back through the White House without speaking until we got to his office. But he'd calmed down by then. And he said to me when we were alone in the office, "What in hell do you mean by that note?" And I said, "Well, Mr. President, around that table was the Minister of Information of Italy, who is the press officer for the president. If you had been perceived as being rude to the Italian president, the headlines on the street of Rome this afternoon would have been, 'President Johnson insults our president,' or something." He said to me, "You mean it was press in that room?" I said, "Yes, sir, it was." He said, "Oh, well, thanks very much. I thought it was some of your goddamn protocol."
That's what his language was about. Oh my gracious! Yeah. Well, how do you think he handled diplomacy? How do you think he handled international relations? He'd like to go overseas sometimes,
Well,
I think.
but I got to say to you, you see, he had no sensitivity for international relations. I took him, for instance, we went to, I remember a trip to Finland. We stopped off in Finland and went up to the War Memorial, which is a very sacred heart of Finnish national ethnic identity. That this is the war memorial to those who fought against the Russians in the Winter War in 1939, or I guess it was 38. And he went around shaking hands in this wreath-laying ceremony and giving out LBJ pens to the people there, the functionaries, taking them out. And they were embarrassed. It was embarrassing for them to receive from the President of the United States at that war memorial pens with "Vote for LBJ" on it. It was embarrassing. It was a lack of sensitivity. Perfectly decent, wonderful, warm-hearted human being, but the wrong thing to do at the wrong time. He was always impatient about the presentation of credentials. He said, "Can't we bunch them up, for God's sakes?" He said, "When you get 4 or 5 of them, bring them all in together." Well, gosh, the French ambassador doesn't want to talk with the German listening to him. The Cypriot doesn't want to have the Turk ambassador in his company. It's very difficult. But if the president wanted to do it, and he said, "I can't stand meeting these guys one by one. It takes too much time. It's a bore. You figure out a way that I can meet them as a bunch." And I did. We did. We took them over to the White House and gave them tea. The president came in. They all presented their credentials to him all at once. It didn't work. But my point is, he didn't understand the value of the one-to-one contact that you could have with a handshake, a picture taken, what that means in the national press of their country. It was very hard for him to understand the details of that kind of diplomacy. And it was very hard to work with him on that. He was respectful of what I would say, but also impatient. He was always suspicious that I would slip over some protocol business on him. And I was always trying to help him. But I don't know if that answers your question.
He didn't learn very, very well from that, did he? But so in addition to the tragedy of Vietnam, your judgment would be that there was no real advancement of international affairs or international diplomacy.
No,
under
he had
Johnson.
one thing going for him on one way he felt very much at home. He always felt at home with anybody who'd been elected. Now, he would sit down with Harold Wilson, and Harold Wilson was a good old tough politician, and he would take out a map. He would take out a map of, let's say, I think it was London, and he would point out to him the electoral districts where Labour was strong and where it wasn't, and explain to LBJ why he had lost in Scotland, Glasgow, or something, and where his strength was. And LBJ was fascinated. Absolutely. Tell me more, Harold. I mean, he absolutely loved it. He and Harold Wilson got along just great. Whenever the fellow, his colleague, was elected and they could talk politics, they got along fine. He hated Europeans and others. The foreign languages got him bollocksed. He was impatient with that, and the interpreters. He couldn't stand all that stuff. And he didn't quite get it when, I mean, people like the Shah would drive him crazy. Couldn't take it. Wouldn't communicate right. So I saw him get along extremely well with elected politicians and get lost with everybody else.
Yeah. Well, and then when he stepped out, you were lucky by that event, as you described. Then you had a couple of other presidents, and they're followed on by Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
And you had to do with Jimmy Carter to some extent.
Yes, I did. But I was, my appointment came to Morocco. It grew out of my relationship with the King of Morocco during the President Kennedy's time. I took the young king. He'd just been, his father died in 1961, and Morocco became independent around that time. And the king came to Washington in '63. And I took him in, and we had a wonderful visit, marvelous. The two young men got along extraordinarily well, and in the enthusiasm of the moment, King Hassan asked Robin and myself to accompany him back to Morocco. So we asked permission of the president, and Secretary Rusk said they were delighted to improve relations with Morocco. So we flew back to Morocco with the king, and he was our host and was wonderful to us. And years later, I think that experience triggered something in Cy Vance's mind when he was looking to restore relations with Morocco.
I see.
And so I was called back, not although I was a backer of Jimmy Carter. I'd backed him before New Hampshire.
Oh.
I did not find myself congenial with his staff. I could not establish a working relationship with Ham Jordan, with the other people on his staff, and I more or less languished as a supporter, but not in the action. And until Cy Vance called me and said, "We've got a problem with Morocco, I'd like you to help us." I came back. I saw President Carter before I left, and I saw him several times, a couple of times when I came back, but I did not establish a really good working relationship with President Carter, to my regret. I'm sorry I didn't, but I didn't.
Well, now, how would you evaluate his international capacity?
It'd be very hard for me to speak with authority on that, because A, I supported his policies. I think one of the great contributions he made, has made, was the acceptance into the framework of foreign policy as an accepted part of it, the human rights issue. In other words, I think that Jimmy Carter's contribution was that. It's now become part of the established and accepted elements of our foreign policy, and I think that's a great thing that he did. But in Morocco, I did not feel his direct interest. His representative in the Middle East was Saul Linowitz, and Saul came and stayed with me. I took Saul to see the king, who, by the way, was the chairman of the Jerusalem Committee of the Arab League. And in that capacity, Saul would brief King Hassan on his talks with the Middle Eastern leaders. And so I was part of that Middle Eastern peace process from far away. But I can't give you a really good firsthand analysis. Oh, well, one thing, though, I will say, and that was the Carter and the Panama Canal issue.
Oh, yeah.
Now, that I did do. I was asked to help in building public support, congressional support for the Panama Canal Treaty. So I took J. Rutherford and other influential friends of mine down on a tour of the canal zone and to meet with President Torrijos, and we spent several days going over that, came back to the White House, met with President Carter, and he gave me a very warm letter of appreciation for what I did in helping build support for the canal treaties.
Welcome to the continuing Living History sessions with Ambassador Angier Biddle Duke, who is the great-grandson of Washington Duke, the founder of this university, and to Robin Duke, a journalist, a businesswoman, and women's activist. This afternoon's sessions will be conducted by me. I'm a professor of history at Duke, and on my right, Ernie Friedel, a professor of anthropology, and further on my right, Ole Holste, a professor of political science. I'd like to begin with Robin Duke. Robin, this morning, Angie discussed the crucial formative experiences of his life. You've been an extraordinarily strong woman with an interesting and successful life. I'm wondering if you could discuss the crucial formative experiences of your life.
Well, I'm the daughter of a lawyer and the granddaughter of the head of the law firm, the grandfather, who was a tough guy. They were trial lawyers, and I was born in Baltimore. And my father broke with his father during just at the end of the Depression years, about 38, 39. And I was obliged to go to work as a very young girl. I started working at 16. So I think I'm a product of a somewhat difficult background in that I had to start very early in a career, if you will, and the product of a very strong mother who play acted at being the Southern lady. But behind that Magnolia lady was someone made of steel and very strong and influential in my life and gave me a lot of confidence. And so we all packed off for New York, and the two daughters, my older sister and myself, went to work. And I remember I just walked into a store called Lord & Taylor and said, I'd like a job, and of course I'm very experienced, and of course I lied about my age. And the only thing that stopped me cold is the man said, well, you look very nice, and you seem very personable, and you speak well, and maybe you could sell dresses. What's your Social Security number? I didn't even know what that was. So I thought, well, I said, I've forgotten it, but I'll be back with it. And then I went out and reconnoitered among smart people and found out what a Social Security number was, and promptly went and got one and went to work.
When you first went to work, it was about at the beginning of World War II, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
One of the questions that we asked Angie this morning was how the war shaped his life. How would you respond to that question?
Well, I was very interested and concerned, very young, of course, only in 41 when war broke out, when the Japanese attacked us. I was then about 18, I guess. But I joined as a volunteer in the Red Cross, and I was an air raid warden in my neighborhood on 48th Street in New York City. We used to walk the block with a hard hat and a stick, and we thought we were very loyal and very important in helping our troops overseas and defending our city from an air raid. I guess there was very little likelihood of an air raid, but in those days there was a certain apprehension in the United States that there might be, so we were all trained on both coasts, and I took a training program and felt I was a part of the war effort. And at the same time I was working all day during the day, and I moved along and eventually got myself a job in 1944 on a newspaper in New York. And I had no real experience there either, but I had a lot of energy, and I worked hard, and I took night school courses and tried to improve my education. And so I feel as though those war years were important in that I had a sense of being somewhat of a part of it. And the woman that I replaced on the newspaper had gone overseas to be a reporter at the front. So I was to cover her base, which was what we then called in those days the woman's page. And in her absence, I learned how to make up the page, how to write columns under various names that were byline names of our newspaper. And this was one of the major dailies in New York. And literally, I learned on the job with a wonderful man who was the makeup man of the paper, and two very sympathetic editors that used to send me out and cross their fingers. And I remember covering City Hall a few times, and Mayor LaGuardia would say, because there were very few lady reporters, just let that poor little blonde girl in the back of the room come up front, boys. You're so mean to her. So it did pay to be a poor little blonde girl, if you know what I mean, because Mayor LaGuardia I got to know pretty well, and a number of other people in city government, and they gave me access to very distinguished admirals and generals who were passing through New York, and I got lots of good interviews, and it helped me a lot on the paper.
How did your interest in politics develop? Was your family politically active?
My grandfather was the attorney for the governor, Governor Ritchie of the state of Maryland, and he had a very successful law practice and was very politically involved. So I can remember as a little girl, we went to grandfather's house every Sunday for Sunday lunch, and he would have political people there, and I was always curious and listening, just like my husband said he listened. when he was in Austria, at all the politics going on, I used to see all these people, see their pictures in the newspaper, and listen, taking it in a way, not realizing how it was influencing me at the time. But then on the newspaper, I became very interested in politics and in business. And I was particularly interested because of Mayor LaGuardia, who was someone I greatly admired, not just because he was nice to me, because he was, but because I thought he was an excellent administrator. And as I started doing more and more stories about city government, I saw what his problems were politically. And as a matter of fact, at that moment, I determined I was going to be a great woman reporter. It didn't quite work out that way.
But you were the anchor woman on the Today Show, the first, weren't you?
Well, what happened is I got married in 1946 and left my newspaper to go to California where my husband lived, and that was traditional for women. You gave your job up. And when I then had to go back to work again, the only leverage I had was in newspapering, and television was just beginning. And no one who was a distinguished actress or performer wanted to be on television because you looked awful the way they photographed you. You know, they didn't know how to photograph you well in those days. And everything was ad lib. You had to sit there and look at a red light and start talking, interviewing people or giving an analysis of the news. So they drew from the roster of women and men who'd had some newspaper background. And I applied for a job at CBS when I had to go to work again, and they took a chance on me. And in those days, I did the 6 o'clock report for CBS out of Liederkrantz Hall with Don Hewitt, who's now the producer of 60 Minutes, and Mike Wallace. And a whole bunch of us worked there, and we used to get our own news stories, put the news together, look at the red light, and talk for 10 minutes. And we wrote up, you know, I was doing local New York City and state news, but you took it off the AP Wire and UP Wire and developed a few special stories on your own. But that's how I happened to land. Dave Garroway then was on NBC, and they offered me a job to be a freelance reporter for the Dave Garroway show, which was called Today, and it was the early morning show that initiated all those early morning news shows. And so Dave and the Today people sent me to cover the 1952 convention in Chicago, which was an extraordinary experience. And I did special features for them until I finished some courses in business and finance, got my degree, and decided to go into business. I was wary of being on television. I had been married to a film actor the first time. He was a soldier I met during the war, and we married in '46. And he had bad setbacks in his business, and that's why I had to go back to work, and we had 2 children. And I decided theater was not my bag, and that television, as much as I was impressed with the amount of money you could make, I was wary of it. You had 13-week contracts in those days, and you were renewed every 13 weeks by your sponsor. And to me, living from one 13 weeks to the next with 2 young children didn't seem to make sense. So I took courses at the Institute of Finance and decided that I was interested a lot in business, and decided, having written a number of things about women in finance and so forth, that it would be a good slot for me. And I was a very steady sort of person, and my mother had a lot of friends who had money and didn't know how to invest it. They were women who'd inherited it from their husbands. So I went into the Wall Street marketplace and went with a brokerage firm. But I stayed a little bit dabbling in television every now and again until I totally left the business. I was sure it was going to leave me, by the way. I never thought I was what you call, you know, one of those hot properties or whatever it is, but the kind that's going to be a star on television. I'd never been interested in the theater or performing, and it just wasn't my thing, I didn't think.
In telling this story, it's obvious that you got off the women's page rather quickly, and I wondered how easy it had been to get into these fields that are obviously men's fields, or were, for the most part, men's fields. What was your experience in moving into that realm?
Well, frankly, the newspaper world for women was not difficult. I found the men that I worked for Eddie Mahar and Paul Schoenstein, my city editors, two of the nicest men I've ever known in my life. I had lots of trouble in the financial market. I left the newspaper to get married to my GI beau. I went back to work, as I told you, and when I went in Wall Street, that's when I ran into great difficulties. Because in brokerage firms, first of all, a woman wasn't allowed on the floor of the stock exchange. There are just a multitude of things we couldn't do. Naturally, we could trade in commodities, bonds, and securities, but there were many things we could not do. But the thing that was tough about it was there were very few places to lunch. You know, there were all men's clubs and so forth. But because of this, I used to cover all the men's phones in the office. And I picked up an awful lot of their clients, which infuriated them. But I was there all day, you know, like a slave, brown bagging my lunch, chewing on my sandwich while I'm telling this man that Winnipeg Flax is selling off and he'd better decide what he wants to do for July. And I learned a lot from that experience. But I had some very traumatizing experiences that had nothing to do with my business. And now this sort of story is coming out, but I'll just give you only one tiny example. I was looking through the files in the back office and looking up a company to see what their earnings were for the last quarter. And I felt a man's arms come around me, and there was a dirty picture in front of me. And I swung around. I was sort of in shock because, you know, it just was, to me, unbelievable. And this man was standing there who was one of the clerks in the firm, and he had all these pornographic photographs. And I was just overwhelmed, and I just pushed him away and rushed back to my desk. Now, in 1990, I suppose you'd run right in the partner's office and bellow and scream, and I just sat there trembling at my desk, shocked. For me, it was something quite unbelievable. Mm-hmm. And all I can tell you is that kind of what they now call harassment, sexual harassment or whatever, that happened to me, and it happened to me fairly often. And I'm not the kind of a woman who encouraged it, but we were always treated as though, women were, that you brought on this because you initiated it. And it's taken a very long time for women to be able to stand up and say, now look here, I'm in this game just like you are, trying to make a living, work hard, and be a decent human being. And don't victimize me and don't impose on me. And today I would go into a partner's office and I would speak out. But in those days I kept my head down, did my work, and made this man know, of course, that I would never speak to him again and he must stay away from me. But I was a young mother and I was worried about my job, and those are the kinds of, that's just one example. It's not very attractive, but it does tell a lot about what has evolved in these days and how much better things are, we hope.
We hope, yes. Is that one of the incidents that got you interested in the whole notion of women's rights and women's activities, or did that take a while to develop in a more general way?
No, I've always, because I've invaded so many areas where I probably didn't belong, they say, I felt I did, that I've been interested in women's issues. I founded, with a group of women, one of the first girls' clubs in New York for young girls. There were no clubs for girls. There were clubs for boys all over New York. But girls were kind of left out of it, and we begged space behind a boys' club and started a girls' club for little girls whose mothers went to work and who left them sometimes at home and sometimes alone. And then I became really quite involved in issues regarding women because I had a very hard time in my brokerage firm being given decent leads from our advertisements. All the Wall Street firms advertised in the Wall Street Journal, and all the good addresses for the people who write in. The Park Avenue addresses I would never get, but I would get some dear fellow on Lafayette Street who was a lathe operator. Well, I got a lot of lathe operators as my clients, and we became bonded, and I was very devoted to them because they were people who would look at me and say, lady, I can only run this lathe, and my dream is to put my boy through college or my daughter through college. And believe me, when I went back to my office, I would no more have gambled his money away or, whipped him in and out of the market every 5 minutes. It was as if it was all my own money. And I did very well for my clients because I had a lot of good friends in the street who were highly placed in the business world. And I learned a lot and they gave me good advice. And I was able to help my lathe operators, which I'm proud of, some of whom I stayed in contact with for a very long time. And so those are the good things I take away and memories from that experience. Plus, I learned more in Wall Street, and it affected me more profoundly than anything I've ever done in my life in terms of how to manage and how to think about business, and that this mystery that they try to create in the public's mind about what makes the business world and the financial world tick is quite understandable. You can learn how to manage your own money, and you should learn, all of us should, more about how businesses are run and how our economy is run, so that we're better able to vote for the right people who represent us in Washington.
Well,
It's, from your earlier comments, it's clear that you had considerable regard for Mayor LaGuardia. I wonder if you might just comment a little bit to supplement some of the things that were discussed this morning about some of the other political leaders that you found particularly inspiring, or who particularly admirable, and perhaps also talk a little bit about the political leaders whose performance you found less exciting.
Well, I was very friendly with Henry Jackson, the senator from the state of Washington. Scoop Jackson, they called him. I had high regard for him. I thought he was a very remarkable, very able man, wonderful senator. Probably would have been a good president of the United States. I thought a lot of Charles Mathias, much lower key man, not fired up, but a good man and a remarkably good U.S. senator. I was very fond of Averell Harriman because he was a man of taste and quality, and worked hard politically. I think was competent as an excellent U.S. diplomat as well. I admired Nelson Rockefeller a lot. I thought that there were some losses there that didn't have to happen. I thought he had a lot of possibilities and would have made a good president, and thought he was a very decent man. There are a number of people. I now, of course, lobby the Hill in a way on a lot of women's social issues, and of course I'm very fond of a whole number of members of the House and Senate. I'm very fond and very respectful of Bob Packwood, who I think has been courageous as a Republican, and among his peers who don't agree with him, he's very outspoken, very strong among Republicans. I like Bill Bradley a lot and think he's a very able man. I would say that I've been lucky, even just in lobbying, to have an opportunity to know a number of these people and to feel a good deal of regard for what they try to do.
in your experience, how do you think that the whole abortion issue has developed to the point where it's become so significant and so important in American politics?
Well, I don't think it ever should have ended up in the political arena. I think it should be a safe, legal procedure. It is the law of the land, and I think for it to be a political football is a disgrace. It is the right of a woman to choose whether to terminate a pregnancy or not. And childbearing is a very personal and a very important decision. And I believe if your church or you, in concert with your church, don't approve of abortion, then by all means you shouldn't indulge in such practices. But I do not think it should be politicized. I think it's a real tragedy what has happened. And I think for candidates to lose or rise and fall on these issues is absurd. And yet I feel very strongly about it, because if you stop to consider that women only got the vote August 26, 1920, they only got it then, and we might still not have had it by 1930 if women hadn't been very resolute and almost purist on this issue. So when it comes to choice, yes, I am absolutely a purist. I think it should be kept legal and safe and out of the political arena. And to use it the way it's been used is a tragedy, in my opinion. And of course, it's, in this year of 1990, it's a major issue in a lot of campaigns. But I've had debates raising money on this because lots of people say, well, Robin, I don't like one-issue politics. A lot of good people fall by the wayside for just this one issue. They've made the wrong decision. But I say it's like the right to vote. It's like being enfranchised. It's so important that the issue, for me, is that significant that if you're anti-choice, then I'm not going to vote for you.
One of the questions that I'd like to explore is how the two of you work together as a team. And before getting into that, and maybe looking at how some of the presidents that you knew worked together as teams, it might be useful just to go over briefly how the two of you met.
Well, I can remember Robin. The first time I was introduced to her was in the receiving line in the American Embassy in the Soviet Union. I was on the New York delegation to the industrial fair. Was it 60, Robin? 1960?
59.
59. And there was an industrial fair, and President Nixon came over, and Tom Watson, who was our ambassador then, was standing there, and he had this beautiful girl next to him. I don't believe my wife was with me on that trip, my wife at that time.
The ambassador was Llewellyn Thompson.
Ah.
It was 1959.
I beg your pardon.
I just,
You're so right.
Very
You're
naughty
right.
of me to correct you.
No,
I mean,
it
it's
was.
such
It was
a big
Tommy
span
Thompson.
of years.
You're quite right. You're quite right. It was.
This gives us a
And
sense of the teamwork.
so that's the first time that I met her. And then we didn't meet again for some years.
We met again in 1961 when I was trying to reach the president of Peru, and he was the guest of the mayor of New York. And I called the mayor to ask him to help me because I had to speak to President Prado. And he said, come on over, Robin, and have a drink. He's going to be here at 6 o'clock or something at Gracie Mansion. And I went over, and there was the president of Peru.
President Prado.
And standing on his right was Angie Duke, and you were wearing a black armband, and I didn't know. I'd been working in Africa that whole summer, I guess, and so I didn't know about your wife's accident. And I asked you, and you explained your wife had had an accident. And then I asked the president to help me get this Peruvian gold out of customs.
Yeah.
I had a collection of beautiful Mayan gold that we were trying to display in New York, and it was caught in customs. They thought I was trying to bring in some gold. I don't know what I was supposed to be able to do with it, but anyway, I knew what my job was, but I couldn't seem to get it released. And President Prado turned to you and said, Ambassador Duke, you help this poor lady.
Mm-hmm. That's
And
right.
he helped.
It was an exhibit of pre-Columbian art, artifacts. And I
That's
remember,
right.
then went, okay, then we...
Then he helped me. He took me out to dinner and held my hand and helped me with my problems. We got it out of customs and we got married.
There is one piece, though. I mean, wasn't it President Kennedy who suggested that?
Yes, we were going to I was going to a dance at the White House because the Kennedys used to have these dances at the White House, and I went with Angie, and when I came down the receiving line, President Kennedy embarrassed us terribly by announcing, Angie, you need to have a wife in this job of yours. Here's the perfect person, Robin. I hadn't even thought of it until here you are. So we were pretty embarrassed by that, but he had a great sense of humor, President Kennedy. He
Well,
loved
I'll
it.
give you an example of partnership, Bruce. Shortly after JFK became president, I think it was in March, after his inauguration in 1961, he outlined some of the duties that he expected me to perform. And one of them, he said, is I want you to be responsible for the vice president. He said, I'm going to forget him. He's my vice president, but I want you to remember, include him in all official ceremonies. I want you to worry about him. And you worry about him because I don't want to have to worry about him. So as Robin came into my life, I said, Robin, please worry with me about the vice president and Mrs. Johnson. And Robin took over, and she became really quite a friend of Mrs. Johnson. And don't forget, in those days, JFK and Mrs. Kennedy were really the stars of the scene. And wherever they appeared, and the vice president, Mrs. Johnson, appeared, nobody spoke to them. Nobody spoke to the vice president and Mrs. Johnson. I danced with Mrs. Johnson at all the parties. Robin would introduce the vice president to visiting chiefs of state, and I could depend upon her I knew that when Robin was around, that the Johnsons would be well taken care of on all occasions. I mean, that's one example of partnership.
What kind of insight can you give us into the relationship between the Kennedys and the Johnsons in those years?
Well, JFK was a very fair man and a very conscientious man, and very conscious of the value that the Senate Majority Leader had brought to his administration. And he wanted to use Johnson properly. It was his good intention, but he had other things to do. He couldn't sit around and think about how to use Johnson. But LBJ was so sensitive and so publicly self-effacing. For instance, when the astronauts came back, or John Glenn circumnavigated the world, one of the great astronaut ceremonies in the Rose Garden, LBJ arrived a few seconds late and sort of with an air of humility took his place in the back row of the group that formed. And the president and I were in front. I was sort of arranging things. And I saw LBJ sort of half hide behind a pillar. So knowing what the president had said to me, I said in a loud voice, "Mr. Vice President, sir, will you come forward and take your place next to the president?" And of course he was delighted to do so. But I mean, that was my job to think for the president about that. But JFK was very anxious to use the vice president, and their relations were quite correct, wouldn't you say, Robin?
Oh yes, I think President Kennedy was very thoughtful of Vice President Johnson. I think the Vice President always takes the back seat, but that was very hard for Vice President Johnson because he had been such a power in Congress. It wasn't hard to be friendly and warm with Mrs. Johnson. She's one of the loveliest ladies I've ever known in my whole life, so considerate. But he was very difficult, and he and I mostly sparred, and she's being kind. We really did get in some, we had a hard time because he suffered so. And when he became president, it improved, yes, but I would say that President Kennedy was extremely thoughtful of him at all times. But for him, it was painful. You see, they really weren't crazy about LBJ. Maybe that's
no, that's true.
Irresponsible of me to say, or
no, it's true.
Improper or out of line, but they just didn't want him, and he knew they didn't want him.
And the White House staff
and so they treated him with certain scorn, not the president, but the staff. And it was hard. It was the combination of being vice president, which already is a second row seat in the balcony, and not being liked and knowing it. Well, I mean, I think the public today knows that Bobby and President Johnson were not the best of friends. But it was difficult.
What about the transition after the President Kennedy's death? Of course, there was as you say, the well-known tension between Robert Kennedy and President Johnson. But what about the rest of the staff and the key people in the cabinet and so on? Did that transition go well?
No. Now, the Kennedy team, by and large, and don't forget, I had been given the job of taking care of the vice president. So for me, when LBJ became president, I was dealing with somebody I knew and had worked with. And it was not as traumatic as it was for the staff, who had always stiff-armed the vice president, rejected him, kept him out of the Oval Office, kept him out of the president's hair, and then to be turned around and told to work for him, it was impossible. Arthur Schlesinger resigned within 30 days. Most of the cabinet fell out. LBJ asked them all to stay, and some of them, to keep appearances and to show a smooth transition, stayed on for the minimum amount of time. But within a year, they'd all gone. They'd all.
But in the foreign policy realm, you did have Dean Rusk staying on.
You had Dean Rusk.
Robert McNamara staying on. And,
I was thinking of the White House staff and,
yeah, right.
and some of the people like Udall in the cabinet, Orville, Freeman, they all dropped out. The Secretary of the Day, Postmaster General, Ed Day, they all dropped away. Soon. To them, you would say, the president, and they'd say, yes, JFK. No, I'm talking about the President of the United States. To them, the president was dead. There wasn't any other president. And it was very hard for them to accept that there was another president. And it showed, and they couldn't work with him, couldn't. So as soon as decency permitted, they dropped off. But for me, it was different because I had worked with him for those 3 years. So it wasn't hard for me to work with LBJ.
Angie, can I pick up a bit on the question that Ole asked and maybe get you to elaborate a little bit on the question of transition? This morning you mentioned your judgment based on a conversation, I guess in part with Kenny O'Donnell, that had President Kennedy lived, the situation in Vietnam might have been totally different.
Oh, yeah.
And following up on Ole's question, the fact is that a good number of the key advisors under Johnson were the same advisors that Kennedy had had. McNamara, Rusk, McGeorge Bundy, you go on down the line.
Walt Rostow was moved in. And Walt was very much of a hawk.
But what I'd like to just elaborate a little bit on is, to the extent that you knew many of the sort of second echelon, I wouldn't want to demote them, but I mean less than the president. I was wondering if you could possibly comment on your relationships, what you knew about those men, what insight you can give us into these key players in the Vietnam era, because this is an area that Ole, of course, has worked a lot on.
Yes, I see. Well, I don't believe that I could strike any further insights into the well-known players in the game. Ted Sorensen is around, articulate. His book on the presidency is probably the best of all the books. Arthur Schlesinger is around. I can't. Kenny O'Donnell is dead. Larry O'Brien is dead. General McHugh, who is his Air Force aide, is still around. Some of the players are still with us, thank God. I would say that there's a couple of things, though, to be said about some of the first team. First of all, Dean Rusk adopted the policy that the Vietnam War was a defense problem, and that was McNamara's problem. It was not essentially a State Department problem. He would come into the action when asked, but the responsibility for the Vietnam situation and the Vietnam War was defense, and State would adopt a cooperative but not a responsible leadership of that. And I think that in Dean Rusk's Living History Program interview, he made that clear, that he regarded the development of the Vietnam situation and the prosecution of it as purely a Defense Department matter. So so those were two men from the Kennedy era, and it got calcified in the Johnson era, that policy.
Would your judgment then be that under someone like Kennedy, in spite of the fact that you had a strong person like McNamara pursuing his policies, that Kennedy would have treated him differently than Johnson did?
I think Kennedy would have regarded each one as a specialist, like you go to a doctor or a dentist, and he would regard them as specialists and then come up with his policy. I feel his policy would not have been to escalate the war. Now, that's a subjective opinion based upon more or less the conversations that I had with some of the supporting players in this game. But let me bring the conversation back to Robin and Mrs. Johnson and her relationship with LBJ, because I think it was quite interesting and amusing. And I wonder, Robin, if you would tell the story of our farewell luncheon that the President, Ms. Johnson, gave for the Prime Minister of Barbados, I think it was. And you sat on the President's left, and the Prime Minister's wife sat on his right, and what the President said to you about our going off to Denmark.
Oh, well, we were, this is jumping quite a bit in sequence. We had come back from Spain because President Johnson had asked Angie to return so that he could use Angie as his chief of protocol when he ran again. And then between the time we packed up and got back to Washington, he changed his mind because of the war in Vietnam and decided not to run. So he said to Angie, I want to send you to my favorite country because I've brought you back from Spain and everything, and this is a post that you'll just love. I want you to go to Denmark. And Angie came home and told me, and I said, oh, Angie, gosh, I think that's just not a good idea. This is the spring. There'll be an election in the fall. If Nixon wins, we will be thrown out of the embassy in 10 minutes. And if Humphrey wins, he will call you back to Washington because he won't want you in Denmark, because he'll want you to take a job probably in the government in Washington. So Angie went back and told President Johnson this, and he just looked at Angie with a withering glance and said, typical of Robin. Bad advice again. So anyway, then we went to a White House dinner a few weeks later, and it was for the Prime Minister of Jamaica, and I was sitting on his left, and that was unheard of because I was usually way below the salt. And I said, Mr. President, I can't imagine why you put me right next to you at this dinner. I want to talk to you, girl. Oh, I thought. So I said, he turned to me and he said, you know, you're meddling around about Denmark and Angie going to Denmark. And he drew himself up and he leaned over and he said, you know, I liked Angie's other wife. Because he said that I was interfering and that he was sending Angie to this wonderful country, and why wasn't I grateful? And I just told him I was trying to explain. I was being very straight with my husband and thought it was not the best idea, that we wouldn't be there very long. It turned out, and I'm not gloating over this, we were out 7 months. And we were out very quickly, too, because President Nixon recalled all the chiefs of mission in 2 weeks, which was almost unheard of. And I couldn't leave. I had to stay in Denmark till June. Angie left because I had all the children in various schools. I just couldn't uproot them that way, so I moved to a hotel. It was sort of the way I predicted. But anyway, President Johnson and I used to have little run-ins like that periodically.
Before, go ahead.
This morning we were talking about President Kennedy's funeral, and I thought it would be interesting to hear your experiences during that funeral, because you were indeed involved, as I remember. Would you tell us about that?
It was, for me, like for all of us, a terrible moment, but to have a job to do made it a bit easier to get through. And Angie asked me if I would please work at the front door of the White House, and as the chiefs of state came in, and as he explained earlier, they all came, de Gaulle, Haile Selassie, Queen Frederica of Greece, and so forth, would I greet them and lead them into the ballroom where they would wait before the time came for them to march down the street to St. Matthew's Church for the services. So as each came in, I tried to explain what the plan was. And when I put my hand out to welcome General de Gaulle, he put his hat in it. Speaking of the rights of women. And I laughed and explained I wasn't checking hats, but I'd certainly love to keep his. It was very smart, and, you know, tried to be civilized and polite and take him into the room. And then, about 5 times, John McCloy, who was then head of our Central Intelligence, called me to the telephone to say, Robin, there has been another threat to the life of President de Gaulle over the White House phones. Would you go and tell him we would prefer that he ride in a car? Each time I would tell him, he would say, what is Mrs. Kennedy doing? She's walking, sir. I'm walking, madam, is what he would say. So we were so frightened of possible assassins among the crowd because none of us really knew who killed the president, whether it was a group, one man, nobody knew anything. So therefore we were deeply concerned that here you had the leadership of the world walking abreast, about 6 abreast, down Pennsylvania Avenue up to St. Matthew's. They could be picked off like flies, and we were all very frightened. Fortunately, nothing terrible happened, but I remember, and Jay Rutherford reminded me today, Ambassador Dobrynin of the Soviet Union put his arms around me and said, tell me it's not our fault. I mean, there was this overwhelming emotion and feeling of concern. And another funny incident, and again, you were so absorbed in your job, nothing was anything but very sad, but this wasn't a rather amusing incident. When I worked in the Soviet Union, Mikoyan was the contact person because he was head of trade, and I was then at this American Way of Life exhibit in 1959. And he always thought that I had a higher position, and I was somebody in CIA, because everybody in the Soviet Union is KGB from what I could figure in those days. So we'd have a lot of jokes about that. But he was delegated to represent the Soviet Union at the funeral. So coming up the steps of the White House, I have not seen this man now since 1959. And he walks up the steps, Mr. Mikoyan, on the arm of Popovich, Foreign Minister of Yugoslavia, who I had just seen. And he gives him this enormous elbow when he sees me. That is the woman that worked in Moscow. And you can hear him saying, no doubt she's CIA. Of course I wasn't. And when they got to the top of the steps, I scrambled to try to explain that I had married a member of President Kennedy's government, and he never believed me. He just laughed, and went on into the ballroom. But it was quite, and then at one point, when they all were marching down the street, a security man rushed up to me and said, "We've lost Bustamante." He's the Prime Minister of Jamaica. He had fallen behind in the line. Now, bear in mind, this man is almost 7 feet tall. You couldn't lose him. What he'd done is fall back, walking more slowly, and he was among the members of Congress. We were trying to keep all the chiefs of state together, so when we got to the church, we'd have seats for them. By the time I found him and moved him up, the chiefs of state were all in the church, and I couldn't find a seat anywhere. Now, here is a very distinguished leader from a black nation and a black man, and I certainly don't want him slighted in the face of all that one had to deal with, and there wasn't a seat in the place. So I walked up to the only person I knew well enough, Governor Rockwell, and I said, "Governor, would you help me and squeeze and make yourself very small so that I can put Minister Bustamante next to you?" And he did. And everybody moved over and squished, and he was seated. So those are just things I remember from that funeral, and I can always remember Mrs. Kennedy receiving the flag, which everyone saw on television, which was a simple, touching, beautiful moment. And I must say, her conduct throughout that extraordinary period was absolutely amazing. And when, I don't know if it was Prince Philip came down the line or one of the royals, she turned to Angie and she curtsied. I just swallowed hard, and she said, "Well, Angie, I am no longer the wife of a chief of state."
And that story
means I was
goes
curtsied.
back to the time when the President and Ms. Kennedy went to Buckingham Palace.
Oh, yes.
And we were flying from Vienna to London for the dinner at the palace. And Ms. Kennedy asked me to come up on the plane and explain to her what was going to happen at the palace that evening. I had gone over a month before to make all the arrangements. And the question of curtsying came up because we were on the home turf of the hosts. It wouldn't be like in the United States. Would you follow the foreign custom when you're abroad? I said, it doesn't come up because chiefs of state do not curtsy to one another. I mean, and she has the rank of a chief of state. There is no curtsying between equals. Does that explain? And she said, I get you. There's no problem tonight. I said, no problem at all, because you're all equals. So when Robin said, when she curtsied to Prince Philip, and she said, "You see, Angie, I'm no longer the wife of a chief of state." Pretty overwhelming moment. I have one other royal story. We had to rank the chiefs of state in front of the White House for the march to St. Matthew's Cathedral. And by great good fortune, it turned out there were 11 of them, and they just fit in the driveway. And I asked them, when they stepped forward, I said, "Would you arrange yourselves by your country's names in the English language?" And it started off with the King of the Belgium, and it went on down. But when we got to Greece and Germany, the Queen of Greece, who was not a chief of state, was standing in the second rank. And the President of Germany, I believe it was Adenauer, No, it wasn't. It wasn't the Chancellor. It was the President of Germany, whose name I now forget. The President turned to the lady behind him and said, although it's G-E comes before Greece, Madam, will you precede me? And he put her in the line in front of him. Just a little detail of how people treated each other. They were so kind and thoughtful at the funeral. There was no rank or precedence or protocol or anything among themselves. They all were just as, the atmosphere was one of real sympathy for everybody.
Yeah, it was interesting that later that night at the State Department, when the new President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, was to receive all these chiefs of state, because that was certainly the next form before they left the U.S., that then everybody was positioning themselves to have a word with our president. And I remember that Emperor Haile Selassie had the ear of President Johnson, and Hervé Alphand, the French ambassador to Washington, was bringing in de Gaulle, and clearly de Gaulle was not going to miss a step, but continue to march straight for the president. And we wanted to delay him a moment while Haile Selassie finished his little visitation. Not at all. President de Gaulle just struck right out. I don't say that he dislocated
Swept him
Emperor
aside.
Haile Selassie, but he was suddenly this little man, this delicate little man, was dismissed, in effect, by this towering President of France, who said, Mr. President, I have a few words to say, and that was it. So then they were all chiefs of state again in a very serious way. But that was another whole moment, a part of that funeral that really never was talked about very much.
I wonder if you could just comment briefly on, we've talked about presidents and those just in the White House staffs and so on, about some of the diplomats that you've known, some of the people in the Foreign Service, and perhaps some of those who were political appointees, and what were the special qualities of those that you feel were the most successful?
I think that JFK had a particular eye for talent. He had that quality of leadership that is not daunted by excellence or so-called competition. He liked to have men of stature around him, and he could have big men in his cabinet, big men on his staff. He had a great eye for that and had a particular interest in filling diplomatic posts abroad. He was particularly interested in the Third World, and he would put some of his chosen friends and colleagues, meaning people he could trust, in Malawi, in Ghana, in West Africa, and he was very interested in filling that with people who really were Africanists, civil rights experts or human rights experts, who were quality folk. And in the key European and other spots, whether it was Ed Reischauer in Japan, Ken Galbraith in India, General Gavin, who seemed like a good appointment in France, it turned out that didn't work. Freddie Reinhardt was a career man in Italy. But all around the world, it was the mix of foreign service and superior political appointees was a wonderful thing, both for the foreign service, because it brought the best out in them. It really, the synergy between a Ken Galbraith and the Foreign Service staff was simply wonderful to watch. The quality of the cables that came in from the embassy was just wonderfully exciting to see the quality of the reporting come up. The competition between the Politico and the Foreign Service staff really worked. I can't say that policy has been continued. And I think that when it isn't continued, and when you have political appointees appointed only for campaign contributions, you bring the whole system down and you dull the edge of the Foreign Service. They become apathetic because you've taken a slot from them for their possible advancement. And it defeats the system of the Foreign Service, which is the backbone of the implementation of our foreign policy. The only rationale for bringing political appointees in is because of their excellence, either their expertise, their leadership, or their personal civic leadership and qualities. Kingman Brewster, the president of Yale, was a damn good ambassador for Jimmy Carter in London, for example. Really good, first rate. That's the kind of political appointment that ennobles the practice. But if it's not followed, it can hurt everybody, including the role of the ambassador. And when the ambassador's role is diminished, then the Secretary of State's role becomes much more important, and he has to deal personally with these problems. I've seen it, I saw it on the Falkland Islands crisis when our ambassador, who was a political appointee, was not at his post, and Secretary Haig had to deal with that, flying to Argentina and a million other things. He had to handle it, whereas this originated in England, our ambassador wasn't present. There's a long story to what happened. He was relieved of his post. That's one example of a failure in history. Going back further, I remember during the Suez crisis, the poor man is dead now, but Winthrop Aldrich was our ambassador. He was sailing on his yacht in the Mediterranean when the crisis broke out, and we had no top representation in England during the attack on the Suez by the French, the British, and the Israelis, and he was irrelevant, totally irrelevant to the Suez crisis.
Has the other side of that been possibly that secretaries of state themselves have seen it increasingly an important part of their role, that they should be international firefighters? And
well, I must say, looking at Secretary Baker, it's changed the role of the Deputy Secretary of State. Larry Eagleburger today is really acting secretary. The Secretary of State is the ambassador at large, or the Secretary of State at large, around the world, either putting out the fires or doing an awful lot of the frontline work. But the running of the department, the personnel work, the administration, the articulation of policy is being done today. The home fires are being kept by Deputy Secretary Larry Eagleburger. So the answer is yes. And of course it detracts a great deal from the ambassador. We all know the story of Henry Kissinger going to Moscow, and it took our ambassador there 2 days to know that he was there. He'd been there for 2 days until our ambassador found out he was there. I mean, this means that the role of ambassador becomes less and less important if the Secretary of State takes over his functions.
there's another relationship that we really haven't touched upon, but I wonder if you might comment from your experience during the Kennedy-Johnson years and so on, and that is between the National Security Advisor in the White House and the Secretary of State. In the early years, quite clearly, a Dean Acheson or a George Marshall was clearly in command, and the National Security Advisor's role was a rather different one, but it's evolved over the years, and I wonder if you have any observations.
Well, I wonder if it hasn't, that hasn't come from the fact that the Defense Department has become such a large element in our government, and that the primacy of the Secretary of State in the cabinet is no longer a fact. And therefore somebody's got to referee the problem between state and defense. And it devolved on the chairman of the National Security Council. So in the Carter administration, we all know what happened when Brzezinski, in effect, took over the role of determining the foreign policy of the United States, and Cy Vance resigned, which is a wonderful thing to do, and it's the most honorable thing to do when you disagree with policy. And, but it showed the primacy of the National Security Advisor in the balance, in the war, in the struggle inside our government between state and defense.
Angie, I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit on the sort of politics of Washington, because when you're out at a mission in a particular country, some of those missions get along really well with the bureaucracy in Washington and some don't, so it's a variable issue. Just as I think the relations between the NSC and state are, it depends on what the issue is. Vance still had power over some issues, although Brzezinski took some away on others, such as Iran. When you were in the field, what was your sense of the support in Washington? Did you find that the State Department bureaucracy worked reasonably well back in Washington, or did you have occasional problems with it?
No, I was always backed up. I had wonderful office directors. Some of them, like George Landau, who was the office director for Spain, went on to be a most brilliant ambassador to Venezuela, to Chile, Paraguay. Now he's the head of the Americas Institute in New York. But he was my desk officer, so-called. He was the director of Spanish affairs in the department. Couldn't have had a more brilliant, more competent, more capable backup person who not only got on well in the department, but also in the White House. He was a very bright, intelligent guy. Now in Morocco, which was lower down on the totem pole of national interest, naturally I didn't have that quality of support, but I never had any difficulty at all with support from the department.
Did you ever get into the problem of trying to mediate between differences of interpretation, say between INR and the CIA? That kind of thing happened a lot in the Reagan administration, for example.
Well, the answer is no, but I can't help but tell you that after the fall of the Shah, the poor old CIA, which had not predicted it, went out on a limb and predicted that within a year, King Hassan of Morocco would fall. That was leaked just as I was arriving in Morocco. And what, you know, the prediction is father to the intention. And the point was it American policy to let the king go down the drain? And the CIA report very much damaged me on arrival. And I was under a certain cloud because an arm of the American government had predicted the downfall of the king. So I had to patch that one up. And I had to scurry around and patch that up, which I managed to do. But that's an example of how an intelligence report can hurt the national interest.
Just out of curiosity, how did you go about doing that? I mean, what steps did you take?
I am just talking to the king just like I'm talking to you. I'm just saying to Your Majesty, you've got to understand this hydra-headed government of ours. And you've got to look at the record of the CIA on the fall of the Shah. Nobody predicted it. Nobody charted that one. So they're covering their steps. They've just got to say this to create a smokescreen for anything that can happen. Because somebody will say, if anything happens to you, sir, at least somebody can say in the file somewhere they predicted it. But it is not the American policy to do this. This is purely a bureaucratic thing. Anyway, he listened to me and we talked about it. I mean, I brought it out on the table and discussed it with him. And in the discussion, I seem to have gained his confidence.
Do you think the report might have had anything to do with encouraging him to work out the problems with the Polisario?
Sure, absolutely. You bet. Yes, there was a lot to do with that, I'm sure. Well, I'm telling you, I'm worried about Robin in this sense. There's one other aspect of her life that we haven't covered or discussed, and that is the time she ran for Congress in New York. And I wondered if possibly we might touch on that, because we are a team. I backed her up in that race for Congress. And we might touch on that. Is there anything that should be said?
What year was that?
That was 77, I guess.
78.
78, when our mayor had been our congressman. Ed Koch was the congressman of our district, and he decided to run for mayor of New York and give up his seat, and there was an interim period before another election. And we had been advised in our district that a lady was going to come in and run in our district whose name is Bella Abzug, and you no doubt have heard of her. And she didn't live in our district, doesn't really speak for that constituency. And Tip O'Neill, who was a very good friend of mine, said to me, he was then Speaker of the House, if she comes back to the House, we're all going to leave town. I mean, they really didn't like Bella. I don't think I'm speaking out of turn. I don't think, I think if Tip, wherever he is in Boston, would say, right on, girl, because they had a lot of problems with her in the House, the one term she served. And so I went running around all the clubhouses of the Democratic district we were in and asked them, well, what are you going to do and who are you going to put up and so forth. And they were all going to support Bella Abzug. So no other woman was willing to get in the race. And I just made up my mind sitting at my desk, well, I'll just do it, which just means, you know, campaigning for 6 or 8 weeks, and it's just an interim period. So why not? Well, it turned out to be 8 of us running because it was Bella, myself, and then 6 men, all of whom got in the race. And it was great fun, very enjoyable. All of us went around to the various clubhouses, spoke at all the universities around New York, debated, and I can only tell you one terribly funny story. None of these people who ran were business people, or had ever run a business, as a matter of fact. And we would go before a lot of people who were in the business community. So one night at NYU, we were lined up on the stage, and a man got up and asked a question, which each one of us were obliged to answer. And the question was, how do you feel about offshore oil drilling in Maryland? Well, you have never heard more convoluted answers. Everybody had a definitive answer to this question. So I was the end one in the line, and I said, well, I have to tell you that I couldn't give you all these definitive answers that you've just heard, because I'd have to study this problem. But coming from the state of Maryland, where I was born and raised, I know their dependency on fishing and oystering, and if there was any impact into their fishing industry, this would be critical. But I'm not really familiar with oil drilling offshore Maryland. And that was the end of my answer. And then the man came up out of the audience after, and we were all shaking hands and trying to make friends and the like, said, lady, I'm going to give you a little money and support you because you're the only one who gave an honest answer. But in any case, Bella got the nomination. P.S. You know, we had an intramural clubhouse, in effect, convention at a school in New York, and we all got up and gave our piece. And she got the nomination, but we so diluted forces that I said, here's what's going to happen. We'll lose the seat, and we'll never get it back. Because if the man who's running against us, and I was a Democrat running, this was a Republican, was an excellent person. He's still in the seat. His name is Bill Green. He's an excellent congressman. And one of the problems of incumbency is they're there for life, as we were all discussing these days in the political world. But if we lost the seat, that would be losing it for quite a long time, which indeed we did. But never mind. It was a very interesting experience, and I'm glad I did it. I learned a lot.
Did it ever lead you to do something in politics for a more permanent seat?
No, I've never initiated running again for anything, but I've constantly involved supporting candidates and working for people I believe in, and I'm very politically involved, but not to run for office. No, I'd never even thought of running for office. It was just that I could sense that in this particular case, I just felt that that one woman shouldn't be running who spoke from a very, very extreme point of view. And so I just thought it ought to be a more balanced ticket there. But no, I've never run for anything else.
I have one question perhaps before we break up, because both of you are involved in so many ways of influencing politics and influencing good works of all kinds. My question is, do you think that this is a significant way, you must think so, a significant way of trying to deal with current problems in the world when you're not in a regular structured position or not actually a member of Congress or in any way, because you do so much of this other kind of work? How do you see it in relation to the people in office?
I think that, for instance, at the moment, I'm still connected with Long Island University as chancellor. And I must say that if you want to call me a lobbyist, I'm a lobbyist for the education community. And I want to make sure that enough funding and appropriations go to funding education. I've become terribly interested in funding of public education. And I don't see how you can have a political action without informed people who are willing to do something about it. So that's the way I look at it. I consider myself fairly well informed, and I'm willing to do something about it.
But if I could just add, I think you have a very good point that you're making. I really think it is very important to run for office. And I really think terms of office should be limited. When I see Dan Rostenkowski's been in the Congress since he was 24 years old, and I believe he's now 59, enough is enough as far as I'm concerned. I really think it's important to bring to office the experience of business or the experience of whatever else is your other life, where you aren't just a politician. So I do think that people can't, I mean, we do a lot of work, and we certainly raise money, and we certainly try to influence people in ways that we think are constructive and useful. But I do think that people should be encouraged to run and have the courage. Everybody just poo-pooed me and made fun of me, and I couldn't have cared less, because I felt as well qualified as a hard-working businesswoman, let's say, to run for office as someone who spent their life in the political arena. But I think, yes, from Angie's standpoint, the lobbying, if you want to call it that he does, and that I do for women's issues, I think we're heard. I think members of Congress hear your message, and I think we can wield a certain amount of influence to get the message across. But I think it would be great to run for office and win sometime.
We're continuing the Living History session with Ambassador and Mrs. Duke, and I'd like to ask you, Mrs. Duke, about your experience as ambassador to UNESCO, and wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that experience and what some of the sort of interesting highlights were.
Well, it was a very interesting assignment. We were in Belgrade for about 8 weeks, and at that time our ambassador in Yugoslavia was Larry Eagleberger, who is now in the State Department, a brilliant career officer and a really very outstanding intellect. So I stayed with Larry, and that made it even more pleasurable. And as you know, UNESCO is involved with culture, with education, and the sciences. And the delegations to that meeting in Belgrade were a really very interesting group, like a whole UN delegation in mini form. We had, however, as the Director General of UNESCO, Mr. Mbo from Senegal. And Mr. Mbo had politicized his role and had been in the leadership at UNESCO for so long that I think he had totally impaired their operation and had placed in all the key roles his own people, and everything. It was like a fiefdom, if you will. We couldn't seem to penetrate the core. We did what he wanted, or nothing got done. So one of my assignments in going to Belgrade was to see if we could somehow bring him around to understand that the U.S. would pull out of this agency in the United Nations unless Mr. Mbo was more open and more flexible in the way he was managing the affairs of the agency. Much to our consternation and disbelief, he announced to us one day during our sessions that he invited Mr. Arafat to come and speak to us. Now, for the PLO to come and address UNESCO in Belgrade was totally out of context. There was no earthly reason to give this man a platform in an agency dealing with affairs of culture and education. So, as it was a fait accompli and Secretary General Mbo had done this, there was very little I could do to stop him. So I began to lobby all the delegates in the hope that I could keep them away from the gathering at the conference hall, thereby making a statement to Mr. Mbo, look here, this man has no place in our conference, and though he is head of the PLO, this is not the moment nor the arena for him to appear. Well, I started lobbying all our friends, only to elicit a series of different responses. One of them may seem amusing, made me furious. The ambassador from a Latin country said to me, "Oh, it's not important, and I'm dying to meet Arafat." I said, "Why are you dying?" "Well, you know, he's so interesting." Mm-hmm. I said, "Don't you understand? You should stand with us on this and not go to this gathering." Well, he was determined. Well, I worked the entire conference hall, and I'm happy to tell you I'm unhappy to tell you I didn't bring out a majority. I'm happy to tell you the Japanese joined us, the Australians joined us, the New Zealanders, the Canadians, and the British. Everybody else stayed to shake Mr. Arafat's hand and to listen to what he had to say. Now, these are the kind of political, I call them shenanigans, that go on, which give you some indication of, even though this is not an important issue, how little importance they attach to joining with you and showing solidarity at critical moments. This wasn't important in the sense that the world was not going to come to an end and there wasn't going to be a war declared, but it does give you some indication of how difficult it is for us to do business very often with even our friends and colleagues. When we weren't in that situation in Belgrade with Arafat, we had another interesting experience in that in the middle of one of our sessions, the delegate from Kabul, Afghanistan, rose to his feet in consternation to voice objections to the USSR representative who was speaking and defected in effect to the West. He got up in the conference and said, "I've heard all I want to hear, you are brutal killers," and he walked out of the meeting and defected to the West Germans, and they immediately called me and said, "How would you like to have him?" And between us, we arranged for his exit out of Belgrade into Frankfurt, from Frankfurt to the United States. And I could tell you a whole saga about him because I speak to him once a week on the telephone. This has been going on for years now, and we're very fast friends. And he was a very distinguished Afghan who gave up his country and his life there because of the war and the tragedy of the war. But those were some of the things that happened there. We were supposed to be dealing with education and culture and science. But those incidents took place, which were really quite interesting.
And you had a Duke University professor on your team.
John Hope Franklin was in our delegation, yes.
Let me follow up on a somewhat different note, and that is when you were talking about John F. Kennedy growing as a result of the disaster at the Bay of Pigs and how he responded to that, it occurred to me that very often how we respond either to failures or adversity or serious setbacks in our lives say as much about us as our successes. And I was wondering if each of you might comment on any of those particularly adverse moments in your lives where, in responding to them, you grew as individuals.
That's a very profound question. If you're referring to President Kennedy, my point about him was his tremendous capacity for growth. He inherited the Bay of Pigs. It was not his initiation. He didn't have the mandate, he thought, with his 110,000 vote plurality, to overturn a project that had been initiated by the Supreme Allied Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, who had been his predecessor as President Eisenhower. That Bay of Pigs operation had been initiated during the Eisenhower presidency under Allen Dulles. He didn't feel he could dismiss Allen Dulles yet because of the fact that he was going to try to run a bipartisan presidency until he got a mandate in 1964. So my point about him is that the tragedy of the Bay of Pigs, he learned from it, and because he could grow, he enveloped that into his character and personality and went on from there. And that's why I think the terrible thing, I'm glad it happened early in the administration, so that later on, when the Cuban Missile Crisis came, he was a much more mature person who profited from the adversity in the first part so that he could overcome it later on. If you're speaking personally, of course, naturally, the loss of my wife 6 months after President's inauguration was an unspeakable blow to me. I mean, it was unspeakable. And I don't know if I grew as a result of that terrible tragedy or not. But life has to go on. You have to move ahead in life. And thank God I found Robin. And she has helped me, and we've gone on together. Now, I don't know if I've grown from that or I've learned anything from it. I certainly hope something good came out of that horrible event in my life.
I wonder if it's growing is the word, or more, you know, a sense of your own mortality and a sense of the need to reckon with the basics of life. I think it pushes away all the trivia and makes you realize what counts and what matters. And I think that's what gives you the strength to pick up your hat and go on. And all of us have had some kind of tragedy and had to either continue living with it if it's a sickness or a grave problem of that sort, or a terrible death. But all of us, I guess, are tested, and it really does help you to define your values more than anything else, and to know that you should carry on, and that a lot of things we worry about are very trivial, and sometimes we waste a lot of time over trivia.
Can we go back perhaps to less profound considerations? You went from being an independent businesswoman, as I understand it, to the wife of a man who had very significant duties in the government. And I wondered how you dealt with that change, what difference it made in your life, and what was it like to be a diplomat's wife and to be in the position of wife under those circumstances?
Well, one of the things that shocked me, of course, I was used to earning my own living, having my own money, if you will, you know, coming in each week, and then my sense of my own persona. And suddenly, when you're the wife of a diplomat, particularly in those days, you really are, yes, you are the partner, but you are also, you know, the appendage, because it is your responsibility to help your husband. And there isn't any if or but about it. It is accepted that you will step right in and roll up your sleeves and go to work. And you do some very menial things. I can remember chasing petticoats all around Washington for the wife of a president of the Côte d'Ivoire, because Balmain had not packed her petticoat. And suddenly I asked myself, standing in a bridal shop on Connecticut Avenue, Robin Duke, what are you doing? You had more important things to do. But that's part of being wife of the chief of protocol, is running around explaining to many of the delightful women who came in the onslaught of independent African nations to Washington to live and had not used all the fancy equipment of dishwashers and washing machines and grocery stores where they punch, rattle, and roll, and you tried to take a new ambassador's wife through the rituals. And it was fun in that sense, and I made a lot of lovely friends of people I would never have known before, so that was an adventure. But for a woman who's been independent in business, is full of ideas about women's rights and so forth, you have quite an adjustment to make. And I had children. I had 2 teenage children. My husband had 2 very young children. So that too was a big family responsibility each day. Getting this to school, and did you do that homework, and you know, are you organized? My children were in boarding school, but I was in very steady communication, because just a little aside to tell you, my son, who was 16, said, "Mother, you mean," before I married, "you're marrying a man who doesn't know how to ski?" I said, "No, he's never skied." "Oh, Mother, it'll never work." So I had to deal with him at boarding school and keep telling him, "Jeffrey, things are fine, we're still married."
Does he know how to ski now?
We got him on skis. Now he has more ski clothes than Tony Seiler, who's a great downhill racer. But in any event, I had to run my children and my house. And that's another thing about women. They not only have whatever their job is, but they've also got to run the shop. And this is sometimes hard for men to understand. But I plunged in, and yes, I must say it was very interesting and quite different than being the wife of a corporate executive. The level of people you met and dealt with were very stimulating. So there were a lot of compensations. But when we left protocol and went overseas into an embassy, that was a different kind of an operation, still a big commitment. But I did have a keen desire to, you know, do a few things outside of my duties as wife of the ambassador. And I tried to get involved in some of the local women's work, and I did. And I spoke to the securities brokers of Madrid, for example, which shook them up terrifically to have a lady talking about the stock market. And I got involved in some social work, which I enjoyed and found very interesting. And then when we finally were, when our very last post in Morocco, which was, of course, as you know, an Arab nation, I found, first of all, I had to resign from one of my major corporate boards because we were manufacturing an aircraft that the king was negotiating to buy. And if the wife of the ambassador was on the board of that company, that might prove to be a conflict of interest, so I resigned. That made me unhappy, but I understood it very well. And I'm happy to say they invited me to come back on the board when I returned home. But those were things that were, you know, at the moment a little irritating, but understandable. It's an adjustment, yes, particularly for a very independent lady like me. But somehow I try to adjust.
May I make a comment?
Yes.
I had the experience of being a spouse when Robin was ambassador in Belgrade, and I accompanied her there thinking that I could be a great help to her. And in her mission, I found out very quickly that she was the chief of mission and that I was the spouse. And that when she sat there with the United States of America in front of her at the General Assembly of the plenary session of UNESCO, and I was sitting in the back row and so on and so forth, I understood, and I stayed with her for a month in Belgrade, and I began to understand what it means to be a spouse, and how difficult it is, and I became much more appreciative of her role as my spouse when I had to be a spear carrier for myself when she was out there on the front line. So I just want to say that to you.
I imagine, too, that you must have been very helpful.
I tried to be helpful. I tried to keep out of the way.
No, but I mean in the process of Robin's adjustment to her new life. I'm sure that you were.
She was a pro. She got right into that pretty darn fast and took over, ran the U.S. delegation, and some pretty high-powered people on that delegation, and stood right up there with the Soviet ambassador at the plenary sessions. I was supportive and understanding, but I can't say I was very contributive.
I want to tell you one funny story, though, and that happened in an embassy. I had worked in Africa for an American company just before I married Angie, and I had taken Louis Armstrong on a tour of Africa to introduce Pepsi-Cola, giving concerts in West African and East African countries. And we had gone to Kano, to northern Nigeria, to give a concert for the Emir. There are about 8 million black Muslims in northern Nigeria. And the Emir is the absolute monarch, was in 1960, of those people. And we gave the concert, and he took me through his harem and introduced me to all his wives, and I saw all his children and the little tricycles they bought at Harrods racing around in this adobe palace in northern Nigeria. Years pass, and we're in Morocco, and it's 1978 or 79, and a young man comes down the line, and he's introduced as the ambassador from Nigeria. And he throws his hands in the air and he says, "Mrs. Lynn, I'm so glad to see you." And this was one of the young sons of the Emir that I had met, and he was about, I don't know, maybe 16 or 17, but he had not forgotten. And there he was, and he rushed back to his embassy to come back and bring me a picture of his father, Louis Armstrong, and myself all standing in the palace one day. And so that always amused me, and I got a big kick out of it. So once in a while, I would run into many of the Africans I'd known when I was in business. That prepared me a little bit for diplomatic life, picking up the threads of some of the people I knew when I worked overseas.
Robin, it sounds to me like you've imagined that you could do almost anything, and to some extent you've done a lot. And the question is, as you were growing up, what kinds of, or who were important role models for you, people that you looked up to as people you'd like to emulate? Were there any people that stood out or that made a profound impression on you?
Well, interestingly enough, my best friend was a girl called Polly Patterson, and her father was the publisher of the Baltimore Sun paper. And her father and mother, particularly her mother, made a great impression on me. She was Scottish and very crisp and terse, and everything she said, she meant. And she said very little, but when she did, you listened very hard. And she was demanding and strict. And I was brought up in that sort of an atmosphere, even in my own household. And I think perhaps my own mother, who had a softer touch, but who inside was very strong, had a very great influence on me. Of notable people, I think the woman I looked up to the most in my growing up period well into adulthood was Eleanor Roosevelt, who I thought was very special. Intelligent, kind, thoughtful, and to me, a very extraordinarily courageous woman. I had a lot of admiration for her. I don't, one likes to think they can model themselves after people, but I think you certainly can take examples and inspiration, and I certainly did from her. She was remarkable.
And Angie, what about you? Your dad dies when you're 7 years old, and
we always had interesting people in our house when I was growing up. My grandfather was a very interesting man. He was the founder of the Marine Corps, one of the founders of the Marine Corps Reserve. He was a colonel in the Reserve, and he was the author of a combat manual called the Do or Die Manual of the Marine Corps, which I understand is still in use. He also was a Sunday school teacher. He formed a movement at one time called Athletic Christianity. You fight your way to God. And he was a very charismatic and interesting figure. And of course, made a great impression on me. But in our house would come people like David Bruce, who was a great friend of my family's. And David, I think, we saw quite a good deal of him when I was young, in my teenage years. My Uncle Tony I've mentioned. I think in terms of reading, the president I think I was most curious and interested in and really thought was a really great man was Woodrow Wilson. I was fascinated by Wilson. I thought he had a vision of the world, a vision of the future of mankind, a future of humanity and the United States' role in it, which has been rarely equaled. His dream of the League of Nations, founded as we know, his 14 points, his idealism. I thought Wilson, was a great president and a man of world and universal stature, and that we'll be studying the former president of Princeton and of the United States for a long time to come. I think he's got a lot to teach us. And then there were diplomats. I was fascinated by Bill Bullitt, for example. Not that I particularly liked him, but I was fascinated by his role in opening up relations with the Soviet Union. And I got to know him over years. His daughter married Nick Biddle, who's my double first cousin. And I got to know him later on. But it was the Grus in Japan, Alexander Kirk in Cairo. Those were my gods and my heroes in that period of the 30s and 40s.
On a related issue, one of the things that's happening at Duke, I suppose, over time is there's a Duke network that's developing in Washington and elsewhere, Duke connections, and clearly back at this time there were a lot of Yale and Harvard connections. I mean, you can go from Dean Acheson to Joseph Grew. Everybody either went to Groton or Yale or Harvard.
That's right.
True of the
The
Kennedy
old boy
administration.
network was very alive, yes. Would you remember the book that was the Wise Men by
Isaacson.
Isaacson?
Right.
Wonderful book. That brought out your point. Those were the men who were the architects of foreign policy in the post-war world, and they did a wonderful job. They did the Marshall Plan, NATO. They set the groundwork for success in foreign policy.
reminds me of another kind of question. You have both experienced the creation of history, as it were. You've been part of it, part of the making of the history of the United States and of the world. If you were asked by a young historian about what your theory of history was as a result of your experiences, what would you say, each of you? How was history made?
I'm old enough and have gone through the Depression and old enough to give credence to economic determinism. That doesn't make me a Marxist, but it makes me feel that economics are the fundamental determinant of man's fate and how he creates a space and world for himself. And I'm very persuaded. Now, the opposite theory is the Carlyle theory of history, and that is leadership, and man determines history. Now, the argument is going to go on. Which is it? Is it the heroes who shape history, or do economic necessity bring forth a leader who will be the creature of the needs of the time? So I think all of us struggle between these 2 points of view, but I do lean to economic determinism. I don't know how you feel about it, Robin.
Well, I also feel we have so exploited our planet. We have made extraordinary successes and terrible messes, and that now I think we almost take a new look at things in terms of how we view the future for the protection of future generations, for the protection of the whole environment that we live in, that we have damaged, and that has, in flourishing nations, we have absorbed so much and we have abused so much. And in third world nations where they're battling for a loaf of bread, and they've got to chop another tree down that sets up another flood motion in order to be able to burn the fire to cook the bread. So I think I hope what we've come into is the realization that we have a combined effort to extend ourselves in a very responsible way to the whole community of humans in this planet, if we ever really expect in any sense of future generations to survive. So it's a combination of men and women of understanding and of real appreciation for what must be done that will, I think, make this world a better place. And how you achieve it and how you reach it historically is I would say, through taking some different views. And some more unselfish views about. I think certainly economics play a major role in how we're going to be able to stay viable, but there's more to it than that now. I mean, I'm not the
Right.
expert
I must
on
say,
this.
though, as a spear carrier and on the sidelines of history, not one that has ever played any part in it, I speak as more of as an observer than as anyone that's played any part in it. But I mean, it's interesting to have been part of it.
It seems to me you have played a part very clearly, because each one of the functions you've had in government could make a difference.
I hope so. I was just the right place at the right time. The desegregation of Washington, D.C. would have proceeded with or without me. Thank God I was there and I was able to do it.
But it happened sooner.
I hope so.
Well,
Sure.
in a way, I mean, both of your lives have been exemplary of a commitment to public service. And picking up on Ernie's question, in the current situation where there's, in the last year or two, one might argue at least a vindication of the containment doctrine, that now there's much more attention to human rights, at least in parts of the world, and there seems to be a lot of optimism and hope on one level. At the same time, we're in a period where we have much more economic constraint on our capacity to grow. There's lots of hunger, lots of poverty, many of the environmental issues you're talking about. And as you look to the future, I'm wondering, with what degree of hope do you look to the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years, the generations that will follow us?
Now, I can't believe that we haven't taken an enormous step forward in the last couple of years. It's impossible for me to believe that we are free from the threat of nuclear war from an East-West conflict. That load is off our shoulders, and I just can't believe that we've gotten used to that fact so soon, on the one hand. The second thing is the international class struggle. The world revolution is over. There is no other role model for countries to turn their minds to. There's no such thing as the liberation movement in the Third World based in Moscow. The world revolution, the class struggle, all of that is gone. I can't believe with those two extraordinary, amazing facts that mankind cannot take a quantum leap ahead, a step ahead. It's impossible for me not to think it. But I don't see any vision of a future. Now, I've heard President Bush talk about a new order in the Gulf, but he hasn't sketched it out. I do believe that as world tensions between the great powers subside, that the United Nations emerges as a central factor in determining the direction of the human race. And I cannot help but believe that the United Nations will become more and more a viable instrument in adjusting relations between states. And I am a great believer in the perfectibility and in the improvement of the United Nations. I think that's one of the things that we have to do. We have to revise the charter, we have to revise the governance, we have to do a lot of work to make the United Nations work better. But I do feel that is the future direction of relations between states. And I think that we should direct our efforts towards perfecting it and using it. And once we get on that track, I think things will, it's possible for an improvement of our lot if we go in that direction. And I don't see why we can't.
On that, we both profoundly agree. We both think the UN is a great instrument if used effectively and well. And in many instances, unfortunately, it hasn't been, and been somewhat denigrated by our own government.
And as a woman's activist, how do you feel about the future role of women in this country, given the fact that we have a conservative Supreme Court that doesn't necessarily bode well across the board?
No, it doesn't. I'm going to be more hopeful about Judge Souter than everybody else because I'm an optimist. He's probably going to give us a little trouble, but I'm going to hope that he's better than they think in terms of the women's issues. I think women have eternally had a struggle, and we will continue to do the best we can to make the point that we are all equal on this planet with different levels of potential, possibly. And I think you're seeing more women in leadership roles, and I think you're seeing big changes in the U.S. Across the world, I'm not sure that we haven't many more leagues to go. But I'm hopeful, and as Angie said, we have a world agency that really has an opportunity there, if we work with them, all of us, to give leadership constructively for a future planet that's safe.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ambassador and Mrs. Duke, for this interview.